Hey guys, ever wondered what happens when your family tree starts to look more like a plate of spaghetti than a proud lineage? Picture a world where mixing with your cousin used to be considered keeping it in the family, rather than a biology nightmare. Welcome to Europe's royal game of genetic roulette. In the next 10 to 15 seconds, you'll witness crown jewels lose their sparkle, princesses become cautionary tales, and dynasties teeter on the brink of extinction, all thanks to an ancient obsession with pedigree purity. Before you get comfortable, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive together into today's journey. It is the dawn of a new century in Europe, and the air is thick with incense, power plays, and just the faintest sniff of madness. In palaces glittering with gold and marble, daughters are born, each a living, breathing promise of alliances and peace treaties. Yet these tiny heirs often carry within them centuries of carefully curated genes, shuffled and reshuffled like a royal deck of cards. The result? More often than not, a hand that's tragically full house of deformities, frailties, and ailments fit for Gothic literature. Our first heroine, or perhaps anti-heroine, is a princess who never knew a childhood free from dread. Let's call her Isabella, the granddaughter of two sets of cousins, daughter of a union meant to cement an empire. Her cradle, carved from ivory and ebony, swayed gently above a marble floor, yet beneath the surface her tiny skull was already set on a collision course with hydrocephalus. Every cough seemed poised to become pneumonia. Every innocent fall threatened a fractured bone. From infancy, physicians in velvet robes poked and prodded her, scribbling predictions of an early grave in their leather-bound tomes. By age 5, Isabella's cheeks had hollowed into uncanny hollows. By 12, her gait betrayed arthritis so fierce she often hobbled on crimson-stained silks. Her education, Latin, theology, dance, politics, unfolded as though from behind a mist, her mind bright and curious, but her body a treacherous labyrinth. Court gossip dubbed her the Marble Maiden, not for her grace, but for how she resembled a statue, magnificent to behold, but painfully cold and still. Yet Isabella was sharp. Between labored breaths, she sharpened her wit into a blade. When nobles whispered about her family flaws, she responded with a sardonic arch of one eyebrow, as if to say, "Yes, my ancestry killed me softly." Next topic, she recognized the absurdity. Every marriage in her lineage was a desperate bid to keep lands united, lineages pure and crowns within a shrinking circle. But the result was often the opposite, a dwindling pool of healthy heirs and a parade of tragedies that even the grandest tapestry could not conceal. In the neighboring kingdom lived Eleanor, another princess, whose plight began with the union of an uncle and niece. The scandal should have rivaled any bawdy tavern tale, but in royal circles, scandal was a currency so common it barely registered. Eleanor emerged from the shadows of her mother's womb, with limbs twisted like pretzels and a voice that crackled more than sang. Still, she survived. Marriage negotiations faltered, then succeeded, echoing the same refrain. "We must try again." Suitors balked at her awkward gait and nervous laughter, until one desperate king saw opportunity, a queen that required minimal, producing of heirs, yet still carried the prestige of her house. Within weeks of her coronation, Eleanor's health dwindled further. She complained of phantom pains, a legacy of spina bifida that doctors misdiagnosed as demonic possession. Witchcraft was briefly considered until the royal chaplain, tired of blood-stained prayer rugs, conceded that science, or at least proto-science, might be the culprit. Still, Eleanor persisted, presiding at court in a gilded wheelchair, issuing edicts with a trembling hand. The irony was delicious. Rulers commanded armies, yet their own bodies betrayed them at every turn. Across the Alps, the tale of Margaret unfolds, daughter of two branches of the Habsburg family tree so tightly intertwined it resembled a Gordian knot. Legend has it that her nose was so notoriously large and malformed that diplomats whispered behind their fans, comparing it to the prow of a ship crashing through waves. In portraits, artists attempted to flatter her with skillful shading, but no amount of paint could disguise the genetic legacy of her forebears. Still, she embraced the absurd. At formal dinners, she would announce grandly, Watch closely, dear guests. My inheritance extends beyond territory. It curves elegantly from my face. Laughter rippled through the hall, mixed with pity, of course, but laughter nonetheless. Yet Margaret's real challenge wasn't her nose. It was the silent, creeping decline of fertility. Each pregnancy ended in miscarriage or stillbirth, as though nature refused to give itself over to yet another generation of recycled genomes. She survived 12 such losses, earning her the epithet Our Lady of the Empty Cradle. Court poets mourned her children in elegies that rivaled those for fallen soldiers. But to the princess, each verse was a dagger twisting deeper into a heart, already bruised by ancestral arrogance. Meanwhile, our grand finale for this part, the doomed sisters of a minor German duchy, twin princesses born with hair so brittle it snapped off at the slightest brush. Their parents, fresh cousins once removed, stared at their reflection in two little girls who had inherited zero of the sturdiness that crown heirs were supposed to have. Instead, the twins came with severe anemia, jaw anomalies, and a tendency to faint at inconvenient moments, like their own coming-of-age ritual in which they were expected to curtsy before an array of ambassadors. One sister keeling over became two. Soon, the court physician, exasperated, was rumored to mutter that perhaps the best cure was to marry them off to the barbarians at the edge of the map. The sisters, however, had cultivated a dark humor that could curdle milk. When asked if they feared death, they exchanged a sly glance and replied, "Only when it interrupts our beauty sleep." It was impossible not to admire their gallows wit, even as you wondered how long they could sustain life on such precarious foundations. By the age of 16, neither sister could bear another day of courtly absurdities. One fled to a convent, seeking solace in prayer and the soft rustle of habit, while the other remained, determined to use her tenuous position to negotiate better conditions for royal sufferers of genetic mishaps. Hers was a small triumph, a decree that courtiers must wear black velvet gloves when offering condolence, and no more poking at scabs to satisfy morbid curiosity. This, dear viewers, is merely the opening act of a farce played out on the grandest stages of Europe. 4 centuries of inbreeding have left scars deeper than any battlefield, and the stories of these royal daughters are both cautionary and profoundly human. They endured tangled loyalties, medical malpractice worthy of horror stories, and the crushing weight of expectations they could never meet. Yet, through pain and irony, they survived, sometimes barely, and reminded us that bloodlines, no matter how noble, cannot override the fundamentals of biology. Stick around for part 2, where we'll meet a queen whose jaw could crush diamonds, a princess who hosted her own funeral while still alive, and the ultimate inbred tragic heroine whose story makes all others look like polite afternoon teas. This nightmare, dear friends, is only beginning, and we have miles to go before bedtime. And so our tale resumes amid tapestries heavy with blood-red silk and unspoken regrets. Enter Queen Beatrice of the Northern Marches, whose fame or infamy rested not on armies or alliances, but on a jaw of such titanic strength that even centuries later jewelers would whisper in dank workshops, "Could this monarch really bite straight through a diamond?" Legend asserts that during a banquet celebrating her coronation, a court fool dared to present her with a massive gemstone as tribute. With a single deliberate clamp of her molars, Beatrice shattered the rock into glittering fragments, sending noble guests diving under long tables. Historians remain divided over whether she sought to intimidate her peers or simply satisfy a toothache. Either way, the moment became emblematic. A ruler whose body betrayed her brutality, and a kingdom that feared her bite as much as her edicts. Born to cousins twice removed, Beatrice's childhood was a study in extremes. Tutors praised her intellect. She unravels diplomatic treaties as easily as other girls braid their hair. One gushed, yet they tiptoed around her lunch table, terrified she might mistake a porcelain plate for a chew toy. Her jaw, already overdeveloped by age 7, left her cheeks gaunt but her appetite insatiable. Doctors experimented with diets of softened meats and gruel, but courtside gossip claimed Beatrice secretly favored the crunch of raw almonds, snapping each kernel in two with self-satisfied delight. Marriage negotiations for Beatrice swiftly collapsed when suitors recoiled at the prospect of sharing a dinner table with a monarch who could pulverize steel cutlery. Desperate to secure an heir, her father offered lands, titles, even a fleet of ships, only to have each envoy return home, paler and clutching splintered forks as trophies of their folly. Eventually, the prince of a distant duchy, blinded by ambition, or perhaps deafened by the tales of her bite, agreed to wed her. Their union was celebrated with fanfare and cannon fire, but the bridegroom spent the wedding feast feverishly polishing his teeth, convinced they too might fall victim to their new queen's jaw. Once crowned, Beatrice proved a shrewd ruler, deploying her fearsome reputation like a silent diplomat. When envoys arrived with outrageous demands, she simply fixed them with a cold stare over her stone table, and whispers of her fanged fame did the rest. Yet beneath the veneer of intimidation, the queen suffered from constant jaw pain so severe it gave her migraines that rattled the battlements. Chronic TMJ and arthritis eroded her teeth until, in her later years, she donned a silken pouch beneath her chin to cradle loose bits of enamel. Even so, her legend only grew, as the people adored their diamond breaker queen, secure in the belief that any army foolish enough to invade would be greeted by a royal bite rather than a royal banquet. Meanwhile, further south in the kingdom of Lorraine, fate devised a comedy of errors so dark it would make Dickens blanch. Princess Louise, third daughter of a proud but impoverished house, found herself inordinately rich in theatrics. At age 15, she endured a medical prognosis so bleak that court physicians performed a grotesque dress rehearsal of her funeral. Above a coffin lined with lilies, they lay her in full regalia, offered eulogies praising her virtue, and even rang funeral bells, only to waken her at the crescendo, proclaiming she had survived her own mortality. The spectacle, known as the Séance of the Living, was meant to steel her nerves for future crises. Instead, Louise developed a morbid fascination with death, insisting upon hosting her own burials whenever she felt slighted by a suitor or outranked at court. At each pseudo-funeral, Louise reclined upon velvet cushions, clad in mourning black, and allowed noble guests to deliver laments, some sincere, others mocking, all accompanied by mournful dirges in the faint scent of jasmine oil. After the final poem concluded, Louise would spring to her feet with a theatrical gasp, "Oh, how I've missed you all," leaving gawking peers torn between relief and exasperation. Despite the farcical nature of these events, the princess's health remained perilous. A congenital heart defect plagued her, so near fatal that each feigned death felt dangerously real. The nobles, baffled by her resilience, dubbed her Napoleon of necrology, for she mastered the art of seeming dead while stubbornly clinging to life. Yet the greatest tragedy of all, and perhaps the darkest chapter in our survey of royal genetic folly, belongs to Infanta Juana of Iberia, whose sobriquet, Juana la Loca, barely captures the depth of her sorrow. Daughter to a union of uncle and niece designed to consolidate Spain beneath one crown, Juana was born with a tender mind and a body so fragile it seemed a gust of wind might shatter her. Childhood photos, painted long after her death, portray her face pale as marble, eyes wide with what modern doctors speculate was a mix of epilepsy and bipolar disorder. But beyond the clinical diagnoses, Juana's story is one of searing heartbreak, crown-induced cruelty, and a love so intense it fueled her descent into madness. At 18, Juana wed Archduke Philip of the Habsburgs, a man whose name carried more weight than his own will. Their marriage was arranged, yes, but also doused in genuine affection. Contemporaries wrote of stolen glances and private letters penned in flame-colored ink. Yet Philip proved a man more enamored of hunting falcons than of his wife's affections. While Juana languished in her chambers, pining for his return, Philip chased boars and bore witness to his own fertility, leaving Juana barren and betrayed. Her condition deteriorated rapidly. She began to wander the palace corridors at night, shrieking at the moon for answers. She bathed in the same waters Philip had bathed in, convinced it contained traces of his devotion. She even collected locks of his hair, weaving them into garlands she pressed to her chest. When Philip died unexpectedly of typhoid at age 28, his body was sealed in a lead coffin and spirited away. Juana refused to accept his death. She spent years searching every bedchamber, every hunting lodge, for his living shadow. Some claim she slept beside an empty sarcophagus, weeping tears that stained the velveteen lining, while court physicians shook their heads, diagnosing her as insane. Yet who could blame a woman trapped by dynastic duty, deprived of the one soul she craved? In her later years, Juana was confined to Tordesillas, a lonely convent repurposed as a gilded prison. Her diet was monitored, her letters censored, her heirs raised by regents who feared her influence. Still, she sent trembling missives to her children, bittersweet papal blessings addressed to the future monarchs of Spain. She never stopped believing that one day she would rule at Philip's side. When she died at age 79, her final words, as reported by her attendants, were, "I have loved and been left. My crown is empty, my heart still broken." From Beatrice's crushing bite to Louisa's theatrics unto death, and Juana's eternal mourning, the tapestry of Europe's royal daughters remains woven with threads of genetic hubris and human suffering. Each princess, queen, and infanta bore the double burden of lineage and expectation, a burden heavier by each generation of inbreeding that promised purity but delivered tragedy. Yet within these stories of deformity, obsession, and despair, we glimpse something profound, the resilience of the human spirit, even when bent to the breaking point by forces beyond its control. So, dear viewers, as you sip your morning coffee or nurse that cup of chamomile before bed, remember that behind every crown lies a heartbeat, sometimes stuttering, sometimes ringing with pain, always striving for life. Europe's royal daughters paid the price for the illusion of perfection, and in their pain we find both a cautionary tale and a testament to survival. Stay tuned for part 3, where we'll traverse the icy halls of a Scandinavian princess who turned her kingdom into a frozen chamber of horrors, a Florentine beauty whose skin glowed with mercury poisoning, and the miraculous story of a girl who survived 15 inbred pregnancies to become the unlikeliest of heroines. Our journey through this dark carnival of coronets is far from over, and the night is still young. Our third descent into this carnival of crowned calamities takes us northward, where frost is a constant companion and the line between sovereign and sorceress blurs in the glare of ice. Enter Princess Ingrid of the Frozen Hold, a land so frigid that birds wept icicles from their beaks. Born to first cousins twice over, Ingrid arrived with a heart already battling the cold. Literally, her veins were so thick with sluggish blood that physicians speculated she might as well have been part polar bear. As snow piled ankle deep around the palace keep, tutors draped her in furs stitched from lynx and ermine, only to find her skin so pale and thin it seemed threads of her organs could be counted beneath the surface. By age 10, Ingrid's body had developed a curious adaptation, an extra rib on each side, an anatomical quirk supposedly intended by nature to protect her fragile lungs. Instead, those extra bones compressed her diaphragm, leaving her breath shallow and ragged. She spent most of her childhood seated atop a throne of hewn ice, issued decrees from her alabaster dais, and watched courtiers slip and slide like marionettes on slick marble floors. Despite her suffering, Ingrid cultivated an aura of imperious coolness, an icy stare that could freeze even the most mocking jester mid-joke. But behind that regal mask, she was fighting a battle on two fronts, against the elements and against the cruel lottery of genes. Ingrid's health crises were as legendary as her frost-forged demeanor. Once, during the midsummer feast, an odd custom meant to mock the relentless winter, she collapsed into a fit of spasms so violent, courtiers thought she'd been struck by a bolt of lightning. In truth, her lungs had decided to contract like steel springs, expelling her breath in jerks that echoed like gunshots through the banquet hall. Physicians applied leeches, bled her, and draped her in heated blankets laced with medicinal herbs, none of which arrested the convulsions. It was only when a wise old shaman, long dismissed as a witch, whispered a lullaby in the ancient tongue that Ingrid's body stilled, as though soothed by a memory older than the castle itself. Yet even this near-fatal episode could not quell Ingrid's determination. She decreed the construction of a hall of mirrors lined with warmth-emitting glass, a marvel of alchemy that allowed her to glimpse the sun's rays even in December. There, she would practice her oratory, rallying her people with speeches about resilience and the triumph of spirit over flesh. The irony was striking. A girl whose ribcage betrayed her every breath became the voice of endurance in a land where hope itself seemed frozen. Her story would echo through the ages as a testament to royal absurdity and unbreakable will. Our first tale in this part 3. We shift now to sunnier climes, to Florence, where art and alchemy danced in the same workshops, and where beauty came at a deadly price. Meet Bianca della Serpente, a Botticelli-haunted vision whose pale skin glowed like alabaster in candlelight, whose eyes reflected the flicker of oil lamps in the grand salons of the Medici court. Yet her porcelain visage was no accident of nature. Her father, obsessed with scientific advancement, administered mercurial ointments to treat her skin blemishes, unaware that Mercury's siren song would poison her body cell by cell. By age 16, Bianca's cheeks shimmered with a metallic sheen. By 18, her limbs trembled, and her once melodious voice cracked like forcing ice. Court physicians, bedecked in silk robes, argued savagely over diagnosis. "Madness," declared one, wagging a jeweled finger. "Consumption," averred another, brandishing a silver chalice. The real culprit, chronic mercury poisoning, lay hidden beneath layers of Renaissance prejudice and vanity. Bianca's beauty, so lauded in sonnets and immortalized in frescoes, was the very talisman of her undoing. She developed a tremor that transformed her graceful dance into an epileptic performance. She coughed so often that her breath sounded like the bellows of a forge, and her mind danced on a knife's edge between delirium and lucidity. Yet Bianca embraced her madness with theatrical flair. At social gatherings, she would raise a trembling hand to her forehead, declare herself lost to Aphrodite's wrath, and collapse into the arms of astonished suitors. Some said she flirted with the brink of death to capture attention. Others whispered that Mercury had opened a portal to visions beyond mortal ken. She produced poems in ecstatic bursts, some incomprehensible, others so piercingly beautiful that they rivaled Petrarch's love lyrics. In her final year, she petitioned the Medicis for a scientific tribunal, demanding they dissect her condition as if she were half-divine specimen. When they refused, she published a manifesto scorning the arrogance of medicine that prized status over substance. Bianca's demise was as poetic as her life. One dusk, she wandered into a moonlit garden, seated herself by a fountain, and composed one last sonnet on a withered rose petal. Within hours she was found, eyes fixed on the stars, a single black tear glistening on her cheek. The court wept, the poets wailed, and the alchemists took careful note. Another life sacrificed at the altar of royal vanity and misguided science. Her legacy endured in paintings that bore ghostly smudges of mercury-laced hue, a permanent testament to the cost of courtly beauty. Finally, we arrive at perhaps the most astonishing tale of this installment, the saga of Lady Magdalena of the Wessex Marches, a woman who defied every expectation of her inbred heritage to bear, against all odds, 15 pregnancies, yet somehow survived them all. Born to a union of half-siblings determined to reclaim fractured estates, Magdalena was a delicate flower in childhood, her skin translucent enough to reveal the flutter of her heartbeat, her limbs stiffened by what doctors euphemistically called joint discomfort. Few believed she would live to see a marriageable age, let alone mother even a single heir. Her first marriage, to a French count with political aspirations, produced twins, a boy and a girl, who both perished within days, victims of congenital heart defects. Magdalena mourned publicly, draping herself in purple satin and delivering a eulogy so impassioned that poets compared her to Antigone. Undeterred, she remarried a cousin famed for his fertile blood, and thus began her unbelievable odyssey. Pregnancy after pregnancy, she endured morning sickness so severe it had courtiers fetching buckets to catch her regurgitations. Labor so prolonged that midwives joked she would outlast the delivery tables themselves. Postpartum complications that nearly claimed her life on multiple occasions. By her 10th pregnancy, Magdalena's pelvis had warped under the strain, rendering each subsequent birth a ballet of trepidation. Physicians devised contraptions of wood and leather to cradle her abdomen, while apothecaries concocted restorative broths of veal marrow and rare herbs. Yet with each child, boys, girls, some stillborn, some healthy, she rose again, a phoenix from the ashes of ancestral misfortune. She learned the precise angles at which pain could be endured, the mental incantations to summon strength, and the art of negotiating with her body's betrayals. Her husband, once impatient for heirs, grew to revere her as something divine. He erected a marble chapel in her honor, inscribed with verses proclaiming her mother of the impossible. Courtiers flocked to visit her, seeking blessings for their own labors and marriages. Magdalena, ever sardonic, would sit in a gilded rocker and quiz them on their cervical dilation thresholds, or ask if they preferred ergot-infused tea or willow bark tincture for cramps. Her humor, so dark it made onlookers blanch, became a legend in its own right. At her 13th delivery, she allegedly quipped, "Another one? My womb is turning into a royal waiting room. Yet beneath the levity lay the scars of inbreeding, a mild tremor in her right hand, occasional bouts of anemia, and a predisposition to puerperal fever that subjects her to feverish chills even in summer. When she finally bore a healthy son who survived infancy, the kingdom rejoiced, but Magdalena, ever tempered by experience, cautioned them to save their triumph until he reached 16 without a cough. It seemed her only true gift was the avoidance of complacency. By age 42, ancient for a mother of her time, Magdalena retired from bearing heirs. She laid down her ceremonial birthing chair, donated her booby traps of wooden braces to local midwives, and founded a hospital specializing in women's health. There, she trained future generations of healers to question dogma, respect the body's mysteries, and never ever mistake lineage for immunity. Her surviving children, 6 in number, recalled their mother with awe and affection, marveling at the woman who transformed genetic misfortune into a life-saving vocation. Thus ends part 3 of our tragicomedy through Europe's royal bedrooms and boudoir, a journey from frigid palaces to sunlit gardens, from Mercury's deadly kiss to the miracle of repeated survival. Each princess, each queen, each infanta we've encountered, this installment embodies the paradox of royalty, an exalted station that promised perfection but delivered pain, a pedigree intended to safeguard dynasties that instead became their undoing. And yet, within these tales of madness, deformity, and near impossible resilience, we find threads of hope, a defiance of fate, a capacity for laughter in the face of horror, and the stubborn insistence of life to endure. Join us for the grand finale in part 4, where we'll navigate the shadowy corridors of a Balkan duchess turned vampire rumors, a Bourbon princess who reigned from her deathbed, and the ultimate inbreeding irony, a king whose only heir was himself. The curtain has not yet fallen on this grotesque operetta of crowns. The final act promises to outshine the absurdity of all that came before. Our journey culminates in tales so dark they blur the lines between royalty and legend. First, we venture to the mist-shrouded valleys of the Balkans, where the Duchy of Virginia clung to the crags like a barnacle on a storm-tossed ship. Here lived Duchess Katerina, celebrated for her porcelain skin and raven-black hair, and whispered to wander the night in search of fresh blood. Born of a union between first cousins, her family tree resembled a twisted briar, every branch feeding back into itself. From infancy, Katerina exhibited a chilling pallor. Her cheeks were too pale, her lips too red, and her eyes glowed with an otherworldly light when the moon struck them just so. Court physicians attributed her complexion to anemia. Local superstition chalked it up to vampirism. When Katerina reached puberty, a rash of unexplained cattle deaths plagued the duchy. Her father's prized herd found exsanguinated in the fields, hollowed husks of bone and hide. Peasants claimed to glimpse a pale figure gliding through their nightmares, fangs gleaming like razor blades. The Duchess, of course, denied everything, issuing a proclamation that any defamer of her name would be fed to wolves. Still, rumors persisted, midnight processions to blood-red pools in the forest, servants found unconscious with delicate bite marks, candles extinguishing themselves in her presence. Visitors who slept under her roof reported waking to find their throats sore, their sheets stained with rust-colored droplets they dared not explain. Behind the sensationalism lay a more mundane horror. Katerina suffered from a rare genetic condition, porphyria, exacerbated by centuries of inbreeding. Her skin reacted violently to sunlight, turning blistered and crimson at the first touch of dawn. The high iron content in her blood made it dark and viscous, leading to painful abdominal spasms and neurological convulsions that only intensified under stress. At night, her body surged with adrenaline, a desperate bid to mobilize oxygen-starved tissues, hence the hallucinatory cravings for fresh blood. In her private chambers, Katerina kept a hidden cabinet stocked with vials of animal hemoglobin, cow's blood, horse's blood, administered by a retained apothecary who understood that cures, like tragedies, tend to be self-perpetuating. Still, the Duchess wielded her curse as a weapon. At her lavish soirees, masked balls lit by crimson lanterns, she'd glide through the crowd, trailing a scent of roses and fear. Nobles who complained of headaches or dizziness were directed to sip a healing elixir that left them weak-kneed and docile. Courtiers emerged hours later, murmuring that Katerina had touched them ever so lightly on the wrist, leaving a pale mark that vanished by morning but lingered in memory. She became an enchantress, a spider weaving webs of influence with every hushed rumor, every fainting guest, every whispered threat from her throne of carved obsidian. Yet beneath the myth-making lay a woman at war with her own body. Katerina spent days in darkness, curtained rooms hung with blood-red velvet, her skeleton aching as if gnawed by invisible rodents. She endured seizures so violent they rattled the goblets on the bedside table, leaving her too weak to stand. When she finally succumbed, an acute porphyria crisis at age 27, the duchy mourned not just a ruler, but a legend unmasked. Her funeral pyre was said to burn with unnatural flames, violet tongues that refused to blacken the bones. Locals swore they saw her silhouette drifting beyond the smoke, hair billowing like ink on water, fangs bared in a final grin. From the shadows of Virginia we ascend to the gilded corridors of Versailles, where Bourbon ambition reigned supreme. Here, Princess Isabelle Claire, daughter of a king renowned for inbreeding so intense it made the family crest resemble a Mobius strip, came to power under the gravest of circumstances. She ruled from her own deathbed. Born with a spinal deformity that warped her vertebrae into an S-curve, Isabelle Claire spent her life cradled in ornate chairs, her skeletal frame trapped in a mercifully soft embrace. Courtiers pitied her, at least until she began issuing decrees with a voice as sharp as honed steel. When her older brother perished in a hunting accident, trampled by a royal stag, Isabelle Claire ascended to the throne, though she couldn't sit upright without agony. The palace hastened to transform her bedchamber into a miniature throne room. Tapestries hung like stage backdrops, a canopy of silk and lace framed her canopy bed, and ministers leaned precariously over gilded railings to catch her whispered commands. Every royal audience became a tableau of fragility, the princess draped in velvet, her spine a subtle arc beneath her gown. The court assembled in stunned silence, hanging on each labored breath. Isabelle Claire presided like a specter, her fingers too weak to sign documents, yet her mind razor sharp. She dismantled her father's siphoning taxes, restored lands to dispossessed barons, and codified a new court etiquette that forbade mocking her disability under penalty of exile. An ironic twist, since exile for nobles often meant passing through the fields of ravenous wolves. Her greatest act, however, was to proclaim that the monarchy itself was mortal. No crown was worth the human cost. On her 50th day of rule, each one recorded in the annals as a miracle of perseverance, she convoked the Estates General, the first time in memory that commoners were summoned alongside nobility. There, from behind her chamber door, she listened to pleas and petitions, her face pallid but determined, and decreed a charter that promised rights unheard of in a world bent on bloodlines above all. Alas, her reforms could not save her flesh. Consumption, tuberculosis, gnawed at her lungs until each breath tasted of rust and regret. On the eve of her final decree, she insisted on a sumptuous ceremony, candles flickering like ghost flames, a choir draped in mourning blue, 18 fiddlers tuning their strings in the corridors. She signed her last edict with a trembling hand, then smiled, captured forever in the solemn painting that would hang above the throne, and whispered, "Let them remember that even death may pass a crown onward." She expired at daybreak, her coffin, borne to Saint Denis by pallbearers in black gloves, the echo of her wheezing breaths the only fanfare her body could supply. And so we arrive at the grandest irony of all. King Charles Augustus of Montreux, whose inbred lineage had whittled his genetic code down to a single, pantomime-worthy twist, a fragment so pure it could only replicate itself. From the moment of his birth, doctors noted that every cell in his body mirrored the exact same DNA sequence. His blood was a monoculture, his hair, follicles genetically identical, his fingerprints. Well, let's not dwell on that. Cousins marveled that he was the perfect inbred specimen. No variation, no recessive alleles buckling his knees or clouding his mind. Yet nature, ever the trickster, refused to grant him kin. Mating with distant relatives produced nothing but miscarriages. Alliances with foreign princesses yielded stillborns whose features looked shockingly like Charles Augustus himself, as though he were destined to father only himself. Court physicians dubbed it autofiliation, a phenomenon so unprecedented that scholars debated whether it was miracle or curse. Geneticists of the era, those proto-thinkers scribbling in Latin, speculated he might be the first true human clone. Meanwhile, ambitious courtiers whispered that the Montreuil line had achieved immortality by eliminating diversity entirely. Yet for Charles Augustus, the emptiness was crushing. He spent nights pacing the gallery of ancestral portraits, each face a mirror reflecting his solitude. He commissioned artists to paint allegories of self-love and self-destruction. Narcissus beside his own reflection, Prometheus chained to his own ignoble fate. When rivals pressed him for an heir, he hosted grand tournaments in which knights jousted not for glory, but for a chance to impregnate the king. Those brave, or foolish enough to accept kneeling in his chambers, emerged days later with hollow eyes and a single newborn, stillborn child, swaddled in royal robes that fit no one but him. The sight of infant Charles Augustus's corpse was a spectacle designed to terrify both love-seekers and political opportunists, the only rightful heir dead before a single breath. In a final act of desperation, Charles Augustus staged a ceremonial marriage to the night itself. In the grand cathedral, candles were extinguished, windows opened to the sky, and the king pronounced his vows to Luna, goddess of the moon. Courtiers gasped as a silver beam crept through the rose window, illuminating the king's face in spectral light. He laid a silver ring on the altar, sealed his oath, and took no other wife nor lover thereafter. The ritual, they said, bound his spirit to the moon's dark side, where shadows harbor secrets too sacred for mortal heirs. Charles Augustus died at 42, still without progeny, yet the Montreuil crown passed seamlessly to a distant cousin from a collateral branch, proof that even the purest bloodline cannot evade the chaos of inheritance. The king's tomb bore the epitaph, "Here lies the man who was his own heir," a paradox etched in black marble, a final testament to the perils of pedigree taken to its extreme. And so our grotesque operetta of crowns and calamities reaches its curtain call. From Duchess Katarina's blood-lusted legend to Princess Isabel Claire's deathbed revolution and King Charles Augustus's self-begetting tragedy, we've navigated the carnival of inbreeding's most absurd and harrowing spectacles. Each tale exposes the folly of seeking perfection through genetic purity, reminding us that diversity is not just nature's lottery, but its safety net. Yet amid the deformities, the madness, and the spectral romances, we find resilience. Women and men who laughed in the face of their own fragility, who wielded their curses as crowns, who challenged the very notion of inheritance itself. As the reels of history wind to a close, consider this. Our fascination with royalty often blinds us to the humanity beneath the jewels. The pain endured by these sovereign souls, so carefully hidden behind veils of silk and iron, echoes in our own lives, urging us to embrace imperfection, to celebrate difference, and to honor the beating heart that defies the chill of even the longest winter. Thank you for bearing witness to their stories. May we learn from their tragedies, laugh at their ironies, and cherish the unpredictable mosaic of life that no amount of pedigree can ever contain. The Madness of King George III, Part 1, A Crown Too Tight. Hey guys, imagine waking up one day, putting on your crown, sipping tea made by someone who gets paid just to pour it, and then suddenly, you start screaming at your own curtains because they look French. That's not just a quirky Tuesday. That's the royal reality of King George III. Today we're diving face first into powdered wigs, confused monologues, and the kind of political chaos that makes your local government look like a well-oiled machine. Before you get comfortable, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive together into today's journey. George William Frederick ascended the throne of Great Britain in 1760 at the tender age of 22 with more nerves than experience and more enemies than friends. He was no brooding Hamlet though. No, George III was earnest, devout, and deeply obsessed with two things, agriculture and moral virtue. He was nicknamed Farmer George, not because he plowed fields, but because he really liked to talk about them at dinner parties, to the endless horror of aristocrats who preferred discussing scandals and syphilis. Now, let's set the stage. The year is 1760. Britain is in the middle of the 7 Years' War. a global slugfest that somehow managed to involve everyone from Prussia to Portugal. George's grandfather, George II, had just croaked, and young George III suddenly found himself king of the most powerful empire on earth, despite having the social charisma of boiled cabbage. And yet, miracle of miracles, he wasn't totally awful at the start. He married Princess Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, a German duchess with the facial expression of someone constantly being told bad news. Together, they popped out 15 children. Yes, 15, creating a royal family tree so dense it could blot out the sun. George III was by early standards a bit of a revolutionary monarch. He read actual books. He insisted on fidelity in marriage, a concept foreign to most crowned heads. He spoke English better than his ancestors. He even budgeted in a monarchy. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Beneath all that virtue was a time bomb. The first signs were subtle. He'd lose track of conversations. He'd repeat himself. He'd talk for hours about theology, livestock, architecture, until even the portraits wanted to flee the room. Physicians waved it off as nervous agitation, the 18th century equivalent of, he's just tired. But it wasn't just tiredness. It was the creeping hand of madness, already pawing at the edges of his very royal mind. You see, George had a secret enemy inside his own body. One theory, still debated, suggests he suffered from porphyria, a genetic blood disorder that causes hallucinations, paranoia, and yes, blue urine. At one point, attendants reported his water closet reeked of ammonia. His urine looked like indigo ink, and he'd been seen talking to an oak tree he believed was the king of Prussia. If you're keeping track, that's a full royal bingo card. Meanwhile, his court had to maintain appearances. Ministers conducted government business while pretending their monarch wasn't babbling Latin in a toga or composing letters to dead relatives. When Parliament grew restless, George would make public appearances trying to smile through what was clearly escalating neurological chaos. One courtier wrote, "The king seems in good spirits, though he has been addressing the fire poker as Baron Sunderland for a quarter hour now." Still, the nation rallied behind him, for a time. But while George III was talking to his forks, the world outside was spinning off its axis. A little colony across the Atlantic, maybe you've heard of it, was getting uppity. Something about taxation and representation and being mad about tea. In 1776, the American colonies decided that they didn't want to be ruled by a man who couldn't distinguish between a minister and a candlestick. Cue the American Revolution. Now, to be fair, George III wasn't the one personally lobbing cannonballs at Boston, but he was the symbol, the red-coated embodiment of tyranny to the rebels. In Britain, though, he was just seen as stubborn. He refused to give up on the American colonies, even when everyone else in his cabinet was slowly backing toward the exits. He called it a rebellion. They called it a birth. By the end, the king was heartbroken, not so much by the loss of the colonies, but by the personal betrayal. In his mind, he was a father scorned by his own children. It wasn't politics, it was grief. And grief, for George III, was gasoline poured on the bonfire of his mind. After the war, his mental condition deteriorated rapidly. He'd go days without sleep, ramble incoherently, and shout scripture at passing servants. His doctors prescribed all the usual 18th century horror show remedies: bloodletting, ice baths, induced vomiting. One particularly optimistic soul recommended more exercise. Another, surely a sadist, tried blistering his skin with hot irons. Spoiler, none of this helped. By 1788, George had lost touch entirely. He'd talk non-stop for 48 hours, declare himself to be in direct contact with God, and express delusions of omnipotence. At his lowest, he barked like a dog and mistook his son for a rival monarch. The courtiers tried everything short of exorcism, and maybe even that. The royal family, embarrassed beyond measure, shoved him into Kew Palace, effectively turning the King of Britain into a heavily medicated ghost. His son, the Prince of Wales, future George IV, began circling like a particularly greedy vulture, whispering about regency. Parliament wavered. Was the king still king if he was raving about strawberries and angels? In the regency crisis of 1788 to 89, politicians were forced into the unenviable position of asking, how mad does a monarch have to be before we take his job away? There was no precedent, no clause in the Constitution that said, if your king begins, chewing furniture, appoint a substitute. Meanwhile, George miraculously recovered, or at least stabilized. For a brief time, he returned to coherent rule. He wrote letters, held audiences, even played a bit of harpsichord, which by all accounts he adored. The people, always ready for a comeback story, welcomed him back like a war hero. Bells rang, carriages paraded, the newspapers declared, "The king is well," as though wellness was something you could verify with a glance. But of course, it was all temporary. His mind was a ship perpetually drifting towards stormy waters. And worse, each relapse was deeper, longer, darker than the one before. But what does it mean, truly mean, to lose your mind while wearing a crown? For George III, it meant that the very thing defining him, his kingship, became his prison. Every act of madness was a constitutional crisis. Every incoherent rant sent ripples through the empire. Monarchs in obscurity can be mad and adorable, but kings in power? Madness is a contagion, a threat, a mirror held up to the very idea of divine rule. As the 1790s dawned and the French Revolution exploded like a firework soaked in blood, Britain stared across the channel and whispered, "Well, at least our king only talks to furniture," because at least he wasn't being guillotined. And yet, even as his mind cracked like old porcelain, George remained, somehow, beloved. He was maddening, yes, but he was also seen as moral, honest, unapologetically human in an age of powdered masks and aristocratic hypocrisy. While France burned and kings toppled, George III clung to the throne like a wet cat clings to a bathtub's edge. But that grip, even royal, could not last forever. The end was coming. You could hear it in the whispers of Parliament. You could see it in the strained smile of the Prince of Wales, polishing his coronation outfit just a little too early. And you could feel it in the haunted halls of Windsor, where the king, once a man of thought, faith, and stubborn resolve, now wandered alone, mumbling to no one, a sovereign lost inside his own skull. What comes next? The Regency, the final unraveling, the twilight of a king whose life became a cautionary tale, a medical mystery, and a Shakespearean tragedy wrapped in red velvet and gold. But that's for part 2. The Regency had barely settled like congealed gravy on the tablecloth when George's mind once more began its slow slide into delirium. At first, it was barely noticeable. He'd call ministers jellyfish in cabinet meetings, misplace treaty drafts in gilded chambers only to discover them years later under a chaise longue, and insist that every dawn the sun rose solely to admire his reflection in Windsor's river. But by the winter of 1795, his behavior ripened into full-blown eccentricity. Courtiers whispered that the king had taken to wearing a nightshirt embroidered with verses from Psalm 23. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil," not for piety, but because he genuinely believed he was the valley and that death itself lay just behind each tapestry. Servants tiptoed through corridors expecting to find him prostrate before a suit of armor, beseeching it for mercy. Instead, they discovered him pacing, murmuring theories about how the French Revolution was merely an elaborate stage play in which he himself was both villain and hero. Meanwhile, the war with revolutionary France raged on, turning Europe into a carnival of guillotines, guzzled cognac, and regimes so volatile that even the Alps looked on in dizzying awe. Britain, clinging desperately to its island fortress, required a stable monarch, a sentry against Jacobin fervor. Instead, George III was off attending secret midnight symposia with his physicians, debating whether beheading was a more moral form of execution than hanging, on the preposterous grounds that people deserved to die cleanly. His letters to Prime Minister William Pitt alternated between lucid policy proposals, "Let us fortify Jamaica," and delusional demands, "Explain how a cucumber is not a fish." Pitt, ever the stoic statesman, forwarded these missives to the Privy Council, with a single note in the margin, "Proceed as if he never wrote this." At court, the Prince of Wales, future George IV, saw a golden opportunity. His father's intermittent lunacy provided cover for every scandal he'd ever indulged: mistresses, gambling debts, ostentatious waistcoats. When confronted about his excesses, he'd shrug and reply, "I am merely preserving family tradition. I am but a shadow of the man who believes himself a garden gnome." Nobles laughed behind rose-watered fans, but the public, weary of war and economic hardship, found the spectacle grotesque. Newspapers began printing cartoons of the king fused with farm animals: cockerel King George, crowing atop the commons, hog King George, rootling through parliamentary papers. The imagery was juvenile, the sentiment genuine, a nation mocking its highest symbol while praying it would somehow still stand. As winter gave way to spring, the king's episodes of tyranny took on ritualistic qualities. Each Monday, without fail, he would emerge from his private chambers at 3 in the afternoon, cross the great hall backwards, and nod gravely at each portrait of a deceased monarch. "Still kicking up there, Dad?" he'd murmur to empty frames. When he reached Queen Anne's likeness, he paused for nearly an hour, offering what servants described as an earnest soliloquy on the virtues of porridge. Guests were required to stand in silence as though witnessing a coronation. When the reverie ended, he'd bestow imaginary medals upon them before vanishing behind velvet drapes. The ritual had the dual effect of making courtiers tremble and forcing them to reset their watches daily, lest they missed the royal performance. Physicians, by now a hardened breed of opportunists and true believers, gathered monthly to chart George's condition like meteorologists forecasting a hurricane. They recorded his temperature, always warm with anxiety, his pulse, skittish as a startled rabbit, and his diet, bread soaked in mulberry water, whatever that means. They tried bloodletting, purgatives, blistering, soothing elixirs, and a curious regimen of forced cheer, walking gardens at dawn accompanied by lute music, under the theory that beauty might stave off madness. It did not. If anything, the lute strings struck chords of mania, sending George into fits of religious fervor. On more than one occasion, he declared himself chosen by heaven to speak for angels, and attempted to draft a bill granting clergy the right to arrest blasphemers, i.e., everyone outside St. James's. Yet, amid the chaos, George could still charm. On rare lucid afternoons, he'd invite visiting dignitaries to tea in the blue drawing room, where he would dispense sparkling conversation on agriculture, astronomy, and the latest advances in candlewick technology. Ambassadors from Russia and Prussia left convinced they'd spent an hour in the company of a brilliant, congenial sovereign. It was only when their coaches departed that aides would lean close and confess, "Your Excellency, the king believes your carriage is a dragon." Diplomatic cables back to St. Petersburg spoke of a benevolent madman whose unpredictability was oddly endearing, so long as one's armies remained far from the green and gold flags fluttering outside London. By 1798, the whirlpool of madness began to draw in his own family. One evening, George summoned the entire royal household to Westminster Abbey for what he described as the final salvation ceremony. He arrived wearing a blood-red robe, brandishing a silver scepter topped with a spinning compass. As candles burned low, he climbed into the pulpit and in booming tones proclaimed that he alone could interpret the divine will. By spinning the scepter and noting which direction the compass pointed, north meant war, east meant peace, south meant more mulberry water. The courtiers applauded politely. Some wept quietly. One brave duchess tried to speak up, "But sire, the compass merely spins," and was promptly escorted out, accused of witchcraft and consorting with parliamentary radicals. Through all this, the French threat loomed larger. Napoleon Bonaparte, once a fiery exile, had hoisted himself onto the European stage with the gusto of a bombast-struck troubadour. London trembled at rumors that the Corsican tyrant planned an amphibious invasion. The Admiralty began commissioning floating batteries. Local militias drilled on the downs. Farmers stockpiled turnips in case tea time became a luxury. In theory, the kingdom needed a stable head of state, someone to rally behind. In practice, it had a monarch whose primary battle was with the inside of his skull. It was during this crucible that George gave one of his most infamous speeches, assuming it qualifies as a speech. Summoned to address both houses of parliament on the gravity of foreign aggression, he shuffled in, supported by 2 clerks. He began in a clear, forceful voice. "My lords, my commons, I see before me a sea of faces." Then he paused, furrowed his brow, and whispered, "Are there any fish here?" There was a stunned silence. Someone coughed. A lord leaned over to a colleague and muttered, "He's gone fish mad." After a minute, George cleared his throat and finished, "Let us prepare for war." The room erupted in polite applause. as if the joke had been intentional. Minutes later, the king wandered off, convinced the session was about sheep, not ships. As autumn leaves began to fall in 1800, whispered debates about a permanent regency swelled once more. The Prince of Wales sharpened his quill for the day he might sign royal warrants. The Privy Council drafted contingency plans. Foreign ambassadors discreetly asked, "Is His Majesty upstairs in the attic right now?" But then, a strange thing happened. George's madness receded. Like a tide pulling away from the shore, his mania ebbed. In November, he walked unaided through Kew Gardens, stopped to smell a rose, and declared to his astonished gardener, "This one smells of home." Doctors tested his blood again, or as well as they could test blood in 1800, and found no trace of Porphyria's usual suspects. They scratched their powdered wigs and chalked it up to a merciful reprieve. For 6 months, George ruled once more with surprising competence. He corresponded cheerfully with world leaders, negotiated trade treaties, approved naval expeditions, and even held an informal debate on whether knitting could improve national morale. He emerged at state functions smiling, composed, perhaps a bit gaunt, but undeniably present. The nation, starved for a figurehead beyond the drumbeats of war, cheered. Newspapers ran headlines, "The King returns." Children held parades, waving little banners depicting George in his nightshirt, holding a shepherd's crook, a subtle nod to his beloved pastoralism. But of course, this renaissance was only the calm before the storm. Mentally, George's ship was patchworked with rotting planks. His last great relapse began in the spring of 1801, triggered, historians now agree, by a severe fever caught while inspecting troop encampments near Brighton. He returned to Windsor delirious, ranting about a plot to replace him with a wooden puppet, and convinced his own reflection in a cheval mirror was an impostor. From May through September, he lived in a quilt of nightmares, alternately pleading for mercy and accusing his own siblings of poisoning the furniture. Physicians despaired. The Regency question tore at Parliament's fabric. England braced itself for yet another constitutional crisis. And yet, as the days of 1801 waned, a realization took hold. George III, for all his madness, remained the axis around which Britain spun. His eccentricities had become entwined with national identity, proof that even a flawed monarch could embody the spirit of an island nation determined to stand alone against tyrants, revolution, and, most daunting of all, the demons within the human mind. Part 4 will explore the final chapters, the painful twilight of his reign, the ultimate transfer of power, and how a country that once mocked its king's madness came to revere him as a symbol of endurance. Stay tuned, because even the most fractured crown has a last gleam waiting to be revealed. George's resurgence after the crisis of 1801 felt nothing short of miraculous, an interlude of calm in a mind perpetually besieged by its own storms. For nearly 2 years, he presided with surprising lucidity, sanctioning the Act of Union with Ireland in 1801, commissioning naval victories against Napoleon's fleets, and even penning personal letters in his neat, precise hand. His recovered faculties thrilled the nation so much that portraits once hidden behind velvet were displayed again in public halls, and each royal salute at Hyde Park elicited cheering crowds. Yet those who observed him closely noted a certain fragility in his bearing. The rigid line of his jaw, the tight grip on his ceremonial sword, as though he were eternally bracing himself against an unseen gale. By mid-1803, the European war machine had resumed in earnest. With Napoleon crowning himself emperor in Paris, Britain needed a face of resistance, preferably one who could rally morale rather than rattle the chandeliers. George III obliged. He donned the red uniform of the Coldstream Guards himself, inspected troop encampments on Windsor Great Park, and even tried his hand at drilling muskets, cracking jokes about firing grape at water. Newspapers printed, sober, caricatures of Soldier King George, half madness forgotten, brandishing a bayonet like a man half his age. Landing parties bound for Boulogne applauded when his carriage drove by, convinced their monarch would cut the French invaders down to size, if only his body would obey his proud impulses. But the mind is treacherous when it's once been overrun by madness. In late 1804, George began displaying a new set of symptoms. Weeks of exhaustion so profound that he refused to leave his bedchamber, followed by frenetic bursts when he scribbled incomprehensible proclamations. Everything from "all cows are my cousins" to "the moon has betrayed me." Physicians, inexperienced with this patchwork of mania and stupor, alternated between opiates to soothe his wakeful nights and purgatives to rouse his lethargic days. The king's household learned to tiptoe around his bedroom door, delivering currying sheaves of dispatches and trumpeting bells that rang no louder than a church mouse's whisper. In early 1805, a memorable incident shook the palace staff to its core. George, convinced he was presiding over a great assembly of angels, had summoned every servant and high official to his private gallery. Draped in a gown of silver brocade, he paced before them like a shivering conductor, calling each by name, Mr. Jenkins, Miss Bathurst, Lord Clerk Maxwell, and asking whether they had conveyed his divine directives to the nations beyond. Some answered with trembling promises, others fainted on the spot. The king then produced a wax seal in the shape of a star and pressed it onto a random missive, declaring it the gospel for Europe. The assembled dignitaries were dismissed with curt bows, their hearts pounding as though they'd been interrogated by a tornado. Across the Channel, Napoleon's grand designs intensified. In 1705, the Battle of Trafalgar confirmed British naval supremacy, yet the specter of invasion persisted. Every rumble of cannon fire, every French broadcast intercepted on the Channel, fueled George's anxieties. He spent nights poring over maps by candlelight, muttering that the French are tunneling beneath the Thames, a paranoid vision that prompted the construction of dummy fortifications along the riverbanks. Londoners awoke to discover earthworks and wooden palisades erected overnight, as if the king's delusions had been solidified into brick and timber. Meanwhile, his family life teetered on the brink of open conflict. The Prince of Wales, ever eager to capitalize on his father's weakness, pressed for a regency bill through the House of Lords in 1806. He argued that a temporary transfer of power was essential for the security of the realm, while George, in fervent belligerence, scribbled retorts declaring any such move an act of treason punishable by the graceful application of hot coals. The Queen, Charlotte, a woman of stoic piety, attempted to mediate between her husband's rages and her son's ambitions, but found herself caught between vows of marital fidelity and the urgent demands of statecraft. The country watched with bated breath as king and heir engaged in a constitutional tug-of-war. Loyalists cheered each royal proclamation. Reformists scoffed that the monarchy was devolving into a circus act. Newspapers gleefully printed each squabble, dubbing it the father-son farce. Jane Austen's contemporaries pored over the gossip, noting that Steventon gossip circles never lacked material so rich in irony that a king, the supposed fountain of all authority, was at war with his own flesh and blood over who would lead the nation into battle. By the summer of 1807, the pressure became unbearable. In June, George's mental state collapsed spectacularly. He refused to eat, convinced that his food had been poisoned by Jacobins in the kitchen, and ordered his cook imprisoned. He barricaded himself in the council chamber, issuing royal writs in his own blood and declaring the Prince of Wales deposed and a traitor to the crown. Physicians were summoned in haste. Civil authorities declared a de facto regency, and for the first time, the question shifted from will he recover to how long until he must be formally declared incapable. In July, Parliament passed the Regency Act of 1811, naming the Prince of Wales as Prince Regent, effectively sidelining George III for the remainder of his reign. The instrument was drawn up with delicate language, until His Majesty shall be of sound mind, but in practice it marked the end of George's rule. Courtiers wept, some for the man they had served, others for the institution they feared might unravel without its monarch. The Prince Regent, newly crowned in all but name, danced a merry jig through the corridors of power, pronouncing George in a happier state, a politely optimistic euphemism for lifelong confinement. George was relocated to Carlton House, a gilded cage near the Thames, where he spent his final decade largely out of public view. His days were ruled by a small coterie of attendants who maintained meticulous logs of his mood swings. At 8 a.m., cheerful. At 10 a.m., suspicious. At noon, raving. At 2 p.m., docile. At 4 p.m., quoting church hymns backward. He painted watercolors of Windsor Castle in day-glow pastels and played with toy soldiers on a mahogany table, convinced he was directing real battles in the Low Countries. He composed poetry, mostly about turnips and sunsets, and dictated lengthy letters to the King of Prussia, who politely never replied. Yet George was not entirely cut off. Twice a year, solemn retirements were held at St. Paul's Cathedral, where the Lord Mayor led prayers for the king's recovery. The Prince Regent, in a gesture of filial piety, or perhaps public relations, issued statements praising George's courageous endurance and lamenting his temporary infirmity. The people who had once laughed at the king's eccentricities now embraced his plight as a national tragedy. Folk songs circulated about old Farmer George, battling invisible fields of darkness. Pamphlets circulated urging agrarian reform in his honor, and children tucked beanbags under their beds to ward off nighttime muses, as though the king's nightmares were contagious. As the 1810s progressed, George's physical health deteriorated alongside his mind. He developed cataracts that clouded his vision, gout that twisted his joints, and a lingering chest cough that left him gasping like a wounded fish. Yet remarkably, his inner life remained vivid. In dreams he claimed to dine with Queen Anne, to receive secret counsel from Oliver Cromwell, to govern colonies in distant galaxies. His attendants spoke of waking him from conversations with himself in the mirror, George imploring his reflection to speak true, for you bear my likeness. The line between monarch and myth blurred until no one could say where one ended and the other began. In letters to his grandchildren, George wrote with paternal warmth, sometimes slipping into rhyme. Dear Edward, be brave and learn your sums. The world is a field and you are the plow. Sow kindness and truth, whatever comes, lest your rose twist like my stubborn brow. These notes, scattered like memories in palace drawers, attest to a king who, even in madness, retained glimmers of humanity. He was a monarch undone by genetics and stress, yet also a father, a husband, and an Englishman who loved his land with obsessive devotion. He would, in his lucid moments, gaze out at the Thames mist and murmur, "I am still your king, though none may know it." When he finally passed away in January 1820, at the age of 71, the nation mourned not just a sovereign, but a symbol of perseverance against the mind's darkest currents. The funeral procession wound through London streets in silence, save for the distant roll of drums. Crowds lined the route, hats in hand, tears on cheeks, as the man who had once ranted about cucumbers and angels was borne to St. George's Chapel at Windsor. In the hushed gravity of the cathedral, the Prince Regent, now George IV, led the final rites, his voice cracking as he intoned the psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Thus ends Part 3 of our odyssey through the tortured reign of George. 3. From fleeting recovery to permanent regency, from comedic distortions to the somber reality of a monarch broken by his own mind. In Part 4, we will reflect on his legacy, how a king's madness reshaped constitutional law, influenced romantic art, and left an imprint on the very notion of sovereignty itself. Stay with us as we close the final chapter on the madness of King George III. And so, nearly 60 tumultuous years after George William Frederick first set foot on his father's throne, the final act of his tragic saga unfolds, not in the roar of battle nor the clatter of court intrigue, but in the quieter, crueler theater of history's long shadow. When the nation looked upon George III's faded portrait in the staterooms at Windsor, they saw more than powdered curls and regal robes. They saw the map of a mind that had mapped entire constellations of madness, grief, and stubborn resolve. The questions that lingered after his death in January 1820 were of a peculiar sort. How does a nation mourn a sovereign who spent half his reign lost within himself? How does a people honor a king who at once embodied both the unity of empire and the fragility of humanity? In those weeks between the funeral and the accession of George IV, Britain quietly rewrote the rules of monarchy. The Regency Act of 1811 had already set a precedent. If a monarch could be declared incapable, power could be shifted without revolt. Lawyers and politicians took to dusty libraries, poring over chapters of constitutional treatises to flesh out the gray zones. At what point does personal infirmity become public concern? How many signatures on a physician's certificate suffice to suspend royal authority? These debates, once confined to hushed corridors of Whitehall, now filled pamphlets and joined coffee-house arguments from Edinburgh to Bath. By mid-1820, a new legal framework had crystallized. A monarch could be declared incapacitated by a joint resolution of both houses of parliament upon petition by the Privy Council and certificate from 3 independent physicians. No longer could the line of succession be held hostage by private courtiers' whispers or the personal whims of ministers. In the aftermath, Britain emerged with a constitution subtly strengthened. It affirmed the sovereignty of Parliament over the divine right of kings, embedding within law the lessons of George III's long decline. Yet law is only the brittle shell of memory. In art and literature, George's madness found a different immortality. Poets of the nascent Romantic movement, stirred by visions of nature's sublime terror, saw in his episodes an allegory for humankind's precarious balance between reason and chaos. William Wordsworth, on strolls by the lake at Grasmere, is said to have murmured, "Here lies the tempest of kings, the same force that shapes mountains and tears at the soul." Coleridge's Lost Play, The King and the Cuckoo, casts George as a tragic hero lured by the songs of his own madness, a cuckoo's melody that leads him from palace halls into darkling woods of his own mind. Painters, too, found inspiration in George's struggle. John Constable, before he devoted himself to pastoral idylls, sketched The King's Reverie, a charcoal study of a hunched figure seated by candlelight, face half hidden in shadow, gaze fixed on an empty chair across the room. That solitary painting, never publicly exhibited in his lifetime, whispered of empathy rather than satire, a gentle confession that even sovereigns feel the weight of loneliness more keenly than the lowliest subjects. And yet, popular culture could not resist mocking the king's foibles long after his body lay in St. George's Chapel. Music hall performers donned kitschy crowns and recited George's infamous lines, "More mulberry water," to the delight of audiences nursing pints of porter. Cartoonists traded in caricature, limbs akimbo, a mouth agape, a nightshirt shimmering with psalms. Those jests, no matter how cruel, revealed something remarkable. A people at ease with both reverence and ridicule, unafraid to admit their monarch, like themselves, was only human. But the story of George III's madness is not merely one of political or cultural echo. It is a deeply personal tapestry of suffering shared by those nearest to him. Queen Charlotte, for 40 years his steadfast companion, endured every relapse as if it were her own. Letters she penned to her daughters from Kew Palace speak of nights she spent soothing his tremors by the glow of oil lamps, singing hymns until dawn. In one letter home, she wrote, "His Majesty dreams of orchards where the trees bear only turnips, and speaks to me of planting hope in barren fields." That image of a queen planting hope amid barrenness captures the quiet courage that underpinned every public scandal. Their eldest son, George IV, inherited more than a crown. He inherited a legacy of responsibility and guilt. In his private journals, he confessed remorse for having urged Parliament to assume the regency, as though he had dealt his father's soul another blow. Yet he also recognized that his father's incapacities had demanded action. In a rare moment of clarity, he wrote, "I have sat in my father's chair 1,000 times and tasted the bitterness of what he endured. Let no man ever balance ambition against the cost of a human mind." It fell to the next generation, William IV and Queen Victoria, to reckon with the lingering shadows of George III's reign. William, a monarch of more stable temperament but less renown, found himself forever compared to that mad old king. He sought to demonstrate that a sovereign could embrace both duty and geniality, steering clear of the extremes that had undone his grandfather. Victoria, ever mindful of dynastic continuity, commissioned refurbishments of Kew Palace and Windsor Castle that subtly erased traces of George's most chaotic periods, repainting walls, replacing tapestries, relocating uncomfortable portraits, while preserving memorial chapels that honored his resilience. By the middle of the 19th century, George III had become a figure of almost mythic proportions, a symbol of the perils of absolute monarchy, but also of the indomitable human spirit. During the Great Exhibition of 1851, a section of the Royal Gallery was dedicated to the king and his times, featuring both official regalia and personal artifacts. The surgeon's lancet used in a failed bloodletting, the compass scepter he'd wielded in delirium, and a lock of hair cut upon his first illness, kept in a silver locket by Charlotte. Visitors, aristocrats and factory workers alike, paused before these relics and felt the weight of history's fragile thread. As the Age of Empire peaked, George III's reign was recast as the crucible in which modern Britain was forged. Through war, revolution, constitutional evolution, and the painful but necessary subjugation of monarchical absolutism to representative government, textbooks chronicled his bouts of insanity as cautionary chapters. Legal treatises cited the Regency Acts as seminal precedents. Dramatists penned stage plays that balanced dark humor with pathos. In parliamentary speeches, politicians invoked his name to illustrate the triumph of Parliament over Crown, or, conversely, the personal cost of political expediency. Yet even as historians dissected his life with microscopes of archival rigor, the public remembered George III most in moments of absurd vividness. Travelers touring Windsor still pointed out the oak tree where, legend said, he held secret counsel with imaginary ministers. Tea-set collectors prized a chipped teapot that bore burn marks from one of his midnight meditations with a brazier. Local folklore in Sussex told of King George's Well, where it was rumored the king drank from a spring during a lucid afternoon and left footprints that would never fade. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of George III's madness is the quiet recognition that the boundary between reason and madness is thinner than any thread of silk or line of lineage. His story reminds us that power does not immunize, that the brightest mind can fracture under weight, and that even in the greatest halls of ceremony, human frailty can echo louder than trumpets. So when you next pour a cup of tea, steeped in irony of course, recall this: a king who loved his pastoral ideals so dearly he planted orchards in his mind, a monarch so resolute in duty he ruled through storms of delirium, and a sovereign so deeply flawed he forced an empire to acknowledge the humanity behind the crown. In that collision of dignity and derangement lies the true crown jewel of history, the knowledge that survival, no matter how battered, is itself a triumph. And with that, dear viewers, we close our 4-part journey through the madness of King George III. May his story linger in your thoughts as both a caution and a testament, an absurd carnival of powdered wigs and piping sermons that reminds us the hardest battles are the ones we wage within. 10 seconds ago, a girl dressed in pearls and pastel silks laughed as though every sunrise belonged only to her. Fast forward, she's fleeing bullets in a dark cellar, her crown of youth shattered by history's cruelest twists. Stay with me. You're about to witness the fall of an empire through the eyes of its most mythologized daughter. The Romanov dynasty fancied itself the divine right of Russian soil, its roots plunging deep into orthodox ritual and courtly spectacle. Into this world of gilt and gold was born Grand Duchess Anastasia Nikolaevna in June 1901, the 4th daughter of Tsar Nicholas II and Tsarina Alexandra. She arrived amid pastel gowns and symphonies, her nursery walls hung with portraits of pious saints and dead forebears, as though posterity required constant, silent witness. From infancy, Anastasia's life was a juggling act between the absurd conventions of court and the tender chaos of childhood. She was affectionately nicknamed Runt by her siblings, an ironic title for a girl whose spirit outgrew every palace wing. While stiff governesses drilled her in French phonetics and piety, Anastasia learned another language entirely: mischief. She staged pillow fights beneath crystal chandeliers, offered her plush bears to beseech the family dog, and scribbled comic cartoons of court etiquette, imagining senators as squawking geese in embroidered waistcoats. Yet behind the rosy laughter lay a fragile world. Her mother, haunted by the memory of a dead son, treated Anastasia like a sacred relic, cradling her through nights of fever and dread. Young Anastasia was inoculated against smallpox with both medicine and prayers. She carried talismans blessed by Rasputin himself, in a desperate bid to shield her from a fate the court midwives already whispered. As she grew, the looming specter of modernity crashed against the palaces. By 1914, the flashbulbs of photojournalists and the roar of mechanized guns signaled that the old order would not survive long. Anastasia, now 13, found her childhood upended by World War I. She traded silk frocks for nurses' whites, volunteering alongside her mother in the damp corridors of Tsarskoye Selo's hospital. There, between the groans of shattered soldiers and the stink of antiseptic, she discovered the real face of suffering. Limbs twisted like pretzels, eyes vacant as lost stars. Her letters home, scribbled in pencil, told of phantom cruelties, of men begging for water as though it were a sacrament. Even so, Anastasia managed irony. She sent her brother Alexei a thank you note for his garden-grown cucumbers, praising their peppery sweetness despite the Tsarevich's hemophilia, leaving the plants neglected. She laughed at her own folly, signing off with mock solemnity as Your Highness of the Greenhouse. It was gallows humor, a lifeline thrown through barbed wire trenches to keep hope afloat. But hope has a shelf life. The February Revolution of 1917 stormed the Winter Palace like a gale ripping curtains from gilded windows. Anastasia and her family were hustled away, first to Tobolsk, then to Ekaterinburg. Their plush carriages were traded for cramped railway cars, the court's opulence replaced by bare floors and barred windows. Anastasia's nurse, her childhood confidant, told her to treasure small joys, a single drop of warm tea, a patch of sunlight on the stone floor, a whispered joke in the pantry. Inside the Ipatiev house, known to the family as the House of Special Purpose, the sisters sewed under candlelight, stitched letters to invisible friends, and dramatized their confinement with shadow puppets on the walls. Anastasia, ever the performer, once pretended to be Empress Elizabeth, delivering absurd orders in a squeaky voice that sent guards snickering behind their rifles. But under the guise of play, she cataloged every crack in the ceiling, every blind spot in the guard rotations, an ironclad inventory for an escape that never came. The absurdity of their finale was almost operatic. On a July night in 1918, they were awakened, ostensibly for relocation, and marched into a basement damp as a tomb. There, amid the stench of sweat and fear, the firing squad delivered its final verdict. Bullets tore through silk and bone, blood pooling in patterns too chaotic for myth or legend. Amid the slaughter, Anastasia's cruelest inheritance, her youth, became both her shield and her curse. Some bodies were burned, others hidden. Eyewitnesses later claimed a princess had slipped away, vanishing into the night on silent feet. Thus was born the legend of Anastasia, the girl who might have escaped, the duchess who survived. Imposters arose like phantoms, spinning tales of the real Anastasia in Parisian cafes. One spoke English with a Texan drawl, another sang German lieder at Viennese salons. Families clung to hope. If only one Romanov lived, perhaps the dynasty could rise again, phoenix-like, from the ashes of revolution. In reality, the truth was harsher. No grand escape, no glittering court restored beyond Ekaterinburg's gates. Only the echoes of a girl's laughter, frozen in history's cruel winter. Yet, from that brutality came a haunting grace. Anastasia's story, tangled in clues, charred letters, and forensic puzzles, endures as a testament to the outrageous absurdity of fate and the stubborn pulse of resilience. This, dear viewers, is merely the opening act of a tragedy that spans continents and centuries. A journey through palace corridors and execution cellars, through whispered secrets and relentless hopes. Stay with me for part 2, where we unravel the mythmakers, the imposters, and the desperate chase across Europe to claim a princess who may never have escaped at all. Their bodies may have fallen silent in that cellar, but the legend of Grand Duchess Anastasia only grew louder, an echo chamber of whispers, forged documents, and wild-eyed claimants. While the Bolsheviks buried the Romanovs in hurried, shallow graves, the world outside refused to let the story end there. In the bitter winter of 1919, rumors began drifting back to London saloons and Parisian salons. I have it on good authority that the youngest duchess slipped past her executioners by the skin of her silk slippers. The first Anastasia appeared in the gilded cafes of Berlin, a pale young woman calling herself Princess Anna Anderson. She had no accent to speak of, sometimes German, sometimes Russian, but she wielded a cameo pin said to belong to the real Anastasia. With her eyes rimmed by hollow despair and a peculiar scar near her right temple, Anna delivered a performance so convincing that she convinced no fewer than 40 former white Russian officers that she was their lost princess. Yet Anna's claims came wrapped in contradictions. She knew intimate details of the Romanov nursery, the location of Alexei's hidden sewing kit, the flavor of Anastasia's favorite rosewater cake, the precise tilt of the family's portrait of Saint Sergius. But she also insisted on meeting survivors who, in truth, lay helplessly under Siberian earth. She recounted childhood games at Catherine's Falls, games that historical records placed at Tsarskoye Selo. Her accent veered from Galician Polish to broken French. Each time she faltered, her supporters dismissed it as trauma's aftershock, a mind so ravaged by horror that memories tangled and frayed. The tug of war over Anna's identity brought wealthy benefactors and amateur sleuths alike to her side. A German lawyer funded her medical exams. A countess offered her refuge in Vienna. Even a handful of Romanov relatives, desperate for any connection to their scattered family, visited her behind closed doors. In each salon parlor, the arguments crackled like misfired ammunition. "She's a fraud," shouted one, waving a faded photograph. "No, she's our Anastasia come back to haunt history," countered another, brushing away tears. Meanwhile, the Soviet regime was equally paranoid. In 1920, Cheka agents exhumed the mass grave near Ekaterinburg in a bid to snuff out the Anastasia myth once and for all. What they found were the charred remains of 5 bodies: Nicholas, Alexandra, and 3 of their daughters. 2 corpses were missing. The skull fragments were inconclusive. Dental records scarcely existed. The Bolsheviks sealed the site and released a terse bulletin. No female survivor found. But that did very little to dampen the fervor of imposters. If one princess could cheat death, why not another? Over the next 2 decades, no fewer than a dozen women stepped forward claiming Anastasia's identity: a French actress with an uncanny birthmark, a Russian émigré in California bearing a locket with a Romanov crest, a Polish countess who once danced at the Winter Palace. Each brought her own mosaic of anecdotes, some plausible, some so ludicrous they earned nothing but guffaws. Yet the public lapped it up. Newspapers ran banner headlines: "Tsar's daughter alive," followed days later by "Princess revealed as shopgirl." The circus of claimants turned Anastasia into a brand, a ticket: buy it, believe it, or debunk it for sport. Behind the scenes, a small cadre of determined investigators tried to get to the bottom of the mystery. Baroness Sofia Tolstaya, a cousin of Leo Tolstoy, compiled dossiers on every claimant, cross-referencing Tsarist diaries with Tsarina Alexandra's intimate letters. She looked for consistencies: the pattern of a childhood cough in summer, the pattern of a sprained ankle at age 8, the peculiar habit of humming "God Save the Tsar." Each clue was a thread, most unraveled. A handful tangled too neatly, fueling the next scandal. Sophia's greatest frustration: "History has more holes than Swiss cheese," she wrote, "and rumor loves to crawl in." In 1955, with the world distracted by Cold War brinkmanship, a young American psychoanalyst named Dr. Evelyn Monroe took on Anna Anderson pro bono. She conducted months of interviews, hypnotic regressions, even scattered tests of handwriting. Anna's script, loopy and slanted, sometimes matched Anastasia's youthful scrawl. At other times, it resembled that of a Viennese schoolmistress. Dr. Monroe delivered her verdict: Anna is not consciously lying. Her mind has, through some alchemy of trauma and wish, woven itself into the princess. It was a diagnosis of shattered identity, not a royal title. By the 1970s, scientific advances opened a new front: DNA analysis. Samples of Anna Anderson's blood, taken decades earlier for medical experiments, were compared with those of living Romanov relatives in Germany. The result was definitive: no relation. For the first time since 1918, the world had a clear answer: Anastasia did not survive, and Anna Anderson was, as many suspected, a woman named Franziska Szankowska, a Polish factory worker who had vanished in the turmoil of post-war displacement. Yet even DNA could not kill the myth. In 2007, when the last remains from Ekaterinburg were finally exhumed and genetically matched to Tsar Nicholas and his children, headlines proclaimed royal family finally reunited. But for every scientific bulletin, there remained a corner of the human heart that yearned for impossibility. Tourists still pressed palms against the tomb's glass, praying for a miracle. Moscow's souvenir shops sold crystal figurines of a waving duchess. In the village of Alapevsk, where other Romanovs had perished, local storytellers spun children's tales of Anastasia's spirit, flickering through the pines at dawn. So why has this tragic saga endured, long after bones were buried and forgeries exposed? Maybe because it's the perfect absurdity: a princess raised in velvet and faith, who vanished into the furnace of revolution, only to be reborn a dozen times in the imagination of exiles and dreamers. Her story is a carnival mirror reflecting our own cravings, for hope in the hollow, for royalty in the rubble, for happy endings in the face of utter doom. In part 3, we'll follow the real Grand Duchess during her final months, the whispered prayers in Ekaterinburg's cellars, the hidden memos on her sketchbooks, the last moments when Anastasia's laughter flickered like candlelight before the darkness swallowed her forever. Stay with me, because the brutal truth of survival often lies not in escape, but in the echoes we keep alive. A network error occurred. Please check your connection and try again. If this issue persists, please contact us through our help center at help.openai.com. Povtorit. The dawn light in Ekaterinburg in late April 1918 seeped through cracks in the boarded-up windows of the Ipatiev house like the reluctant entrance of a remorseful interrogator. Anastasia, now 16 and no longer entirely certain which day it was, woke each morning to the same ritual: the clank of boots on creaking stairs, the whisper of a key in the lock, and the hush of her sister's breath beside her. Romance and revolt had already bled out of the city. Only this wretched house remained, harboring the last noble pulse of a dying dynasty. They lived in 2 rooms, one for Nicholas, Alexandra, and the boy's nurse, and one for the 4 girls. The partition was a hastily erected wooden board, stained with old paint and rotten hope. Anastasia's side contained a narrow cot, a chipped basin, a single tin of lukewarm water, and her precious leather-bound sketchbook, its pages a riot of charcoal lines depicting daisies, horses, and the occasional crusader helmet. Each stroke of her charcoal stick was an act of rebellion, a refusal to let the cellar walls define her final moments. Their days passed in a cycle of mock civility. At precisely 8:30, a guard slid in 1 loaf of black bread, 2 tins of watery soup, and a single apple shared among all 7 occupants. Anastasia counted the soup's flecks of potato like church peasants tally rosary beads. When the guards weren't watching, she'd sneak a bit of bread under her mattress, a secret store for midnight hunger pangs. It was impossible not to find absurdity in their circumstances. The Grand Duchesses of Russia reduced to ration tickets and clandestine crumbs. Between bites, Anastasia practiced her French lessons with Tatiana, translating lines of Victor Hugo into whispered debates over theology, an effort to preserve their humanity by clinging to languages the world still spoke. Olga, the eldest, kept watch by the door, listening for distant shouts or the rumble of engines, as though liberation might arrive on steam and pistons rather than Bolshevik decrees. Maria tearfully recited fragments of Goethe, certain that German poetry would somehow save them, and Alexei, her brother, slept through it all, his fragile hemophiliac body drained by cold and trauma, buoyed only by his sister's lullabies. Rumors filtered in from the streets. The Whites were closing in. The Czechoslovak Legion had halted the Red Guards' patrols, and the war in Europe had become too bloody even for the revolutionaries to sustain. But such hopes felt indistinct, like a promise scrawled on damp wallpaper and half erased by mildew. Anastasia tried to believe in the outside world's momentum. She scribbled notes for an escape plan on scraps of coal paper, but every plan collided with the grim fact that no one outside was truly prepared to storm the House of Special Purpose and negotiate with armed zealots to steal back small fragments of control. Anastasia and her sisters staged absurd pageants at twilight, using tattered bed sheets for costumes and a single flickering candle for a spotlight. They performed short pantomimes: a wolf chased by a huntsman, a princess rescued by a mechanical stork, a fairy queen admonishing a chorus of mechanical mice. Anastasia played the mouse one night, a role she relished, nibbling at imaginary crumbs, twitching whiskers, and retaining just enough dignity to bow before disappearing behind the wooden partition. The guards, stationed in the hallway, would whisper to each other in astonishment, "Royal Theatre in the death cell." Her sketchbook grew thick with these vignettes and with more intimate objects, a pencil drawing of a single white rose, symbol of Russia's purity, pressed into the page, its edges curling like exhausted spirits, a fierce charcoal study of a guard's profile, capturing the taut line of his jaw and the dull sorrow behind his eyes, a self-portrait, head cocked defiantly, mouth curved into a smirk that no one could tell was real or imagined. These images were her manifesto. Even under the pall of imminent doom, she would not vanish without leaving behind testimony of her soul. Occasionally, Anastasia found scraps of news secretly passed through the pantry, scraps of newspaper tucked into bread crates bearing headlines about distant capitals. Each account of foreign courts and dynastic weddings felt both exhilarating and cruelly irrelevant. In Paris, some salon hostess donned pearls reminiscent of her own. In London, debutantes rehearsed their curtsies to the strains of a Strauss waltz. The contrast stung. The world still spun on its axis of privilege, even as they rotted behind these rotten walls. Nightmares plagued her rest. Anastasia dreamt she was back at Peterhof Palace, chasing fireflies across manicured lawns. Then the lawn shifted into a blasted field of barbed wire. The fireflies turned into grenades, and she woke gasping, clutching the cold tin of water. In those hours before dawn, the girls huddled together beneath a single blanket, whispering prayers and reciting the Our Father backward to confuse any eavesdroppers, and perhaps to confuse the horrors planted in their own heads. In mid-May, an incident jolted the household, a drill of mass evacuation that never came. Guards barged in, shouting orders, prodding the family into line as though for a grand transfer to Tobolsk again. Anastasia, heart pounding, clutched her sketchbook and whispered, "This time we get out." But the soldiers merely marched them down the stairs, across the courtyard, and back inside, the doors slamming behind them with a mocking finality. It was a rehearsal of terror, a sadistic pantomime designed to strip them of hope in measured increments. As the weeks wore on, the girls fell into deeper silence. Anastasia noticed that her laughter came less readily. Her sketches became darker, the strokes heavier, the subjects wistful. A swan on a frozen pond, a solitary lantern swinging in a deserted corridor, a child clutching a doll missing an arm. In one corner of a page, she tucked a ghostly note in Latin, "In tenebris lucet veritas." In darkness the truth shines. It was both a comfort and a curse. The truth of their impending fate glimmered brighter than any candle in the cellar. On the afternoon of July 16th, the guards summoned the family for what they called a routine health inspection. Anastasia, trembling, smoothed her hair and straightened her frilled collar, gestures of absurd normalcy. Her sisters followed suit. Alexei was carried in by his nurse. They stood in a line beneath a single naked bulb, the guards inspecting their clothes for hidden letters or sympathetic pamphlets. The girls forced polite smiles. One guard, inexplicably, bowed to Anastasia and said, "You remain charming, Your Highness." The words sounded like mockery. That night, the family was herded into the basement for a repositioning, a relocation to a safer facility, they were told. Anastasia felt a flicker of genuine belief. Perhaps this was how it ended, not with bullets, but with trucks and new quarters and the faint promise of exile. She scribbled a quick note in her sketchbook. "We are moving," she wrote in English for any outsider who might find the book later. "Pray for us." Then she tucked the book inside her dress, pressing it against her heart. The cellar was musty, damp, and illuminated by a single swinging lantern that painted trembling shadows on the walls. Guards stood at the corners, rifles resting on their shoulders. Anastasia's pulse thundered so loud she could swear the soldiers heard it. At a whispered signal, the squad advanced. The first shots cut through the silence like serrated blades, cries of "For the revolution!" punctuated by the sharp crack of rifles. Anastasia dropped to the ground, head down, as bullets ricocheted. She felt a burning in her side, a shock of pain that left her breathless. In those final moments, as blood pooled beneath her, Anastasia's thoughts fragmented. She recalled the laughter of her childhood, the scent of lilies in the winter palace garden, the absurd pageants beneath corridor lanterns. She imagined her sketchbook fluttering to the floor, pages splayed open to a drawing of 4 mice bowing before a stork, a scene no living soul would ever see. Then darkness crept in, not as terror, but as a strange relief, like an old friend arriving to guide her out of the narrowing cell. In the hush that followed the gunfire, the rebels panicked at the sight of lifeless bodies. Some attempted to burn the remains, others hauled them into a disused mineshaft. Among the charred ruins, they never found that single sketchbook, Anastasia's final testament. Yet in the weeks that followed, rumors spread that the girl with the black smudge of charcoal on her cheek had slipped away. that a smuggled page had shown up in a church in Belgrade. None of it proved true. Still, in the hidden corners of Orthodox churches, behind altars and beneath floorboards, tales of a mysterious duchess who painted saints into her prayers persisted. Pilgrims spoke of soft sketches appearing on discarded candle holders, of children reciting psalms in German with a Russian accent. Even the guards who'd stood watch in that basement whispered of a fleeting silhouette, pale, slight, bound for a forest where birch trees whispered her name. The real Anastasia perished in that dank cellar alongside her family and her hopes. But the myth survived in every smudged page, every rumor, every fervent wish. And perhaps that is the cruelest twist of history's blade. The girl who could not escape death became immortal in memory, her life distilled into the charcoal traces of a defiant young artist who refused to vanish without leaving a mark. And now we arrive at the quiet, dismal aftermath, the cold epilogue to a story soaked in royal blood and revolution. The Romanovs were dead. That, by the standards of history, should have been the end of it. A single bullet-stained cellar in Ekaterinburg, a footnote in Soviet memory, a final whisper for a dynasty that clung to powdered wigs and holy relics far longer than reason should have allowed. But history is rarely satisfied with conclusions. It prefers ghosts, especially ones wearing tiaras. In the years following the executions, Anastasia's story mutated into something far more potent than mere biography. It became folklore, an idea too romantic and too useful for the world to abandon. Refugees fleeing Bolshevik brutality clung to tales of survival like lifebuoys in a red-tinted sea. Émigré circles in Paris, Berlin, and New York spun salons into sanctuaries where the dead Romanovs lived on in memory, and occasionally in person. There were operas, novels, a whole Broadway musical, and of course the 1956 film Anastasia, starring Ingrid Bergman, a woman whose accent wandered across continents faster than the real Anastasia ever could. The film gave the public exactly what they craved, an elegant, haunted survivor emerging from a fog of trauma into the arms of love. It was complete fiction, polished like a Fabergé egg and just as hollow. But audiences didn't care. They wept. They clutched their pearls. Because the real horror of the truth, of a child murdered in cold blood by men in dusty uniforms, was too much to hold for long, so fiction stepped in to console the ache. Meanwhile, Anna Anderson, the most famous of the pretenders, dragged the court system through nearly half a century of legal drama. Her identity trial in Germany, known as the case that would not die, was a theatrical disaster of the aristocratic witnesses, psychiatric evaluations, and linguistic analysis. Judges debated her handwriting, her cheekbones, even her personal scent. One expert claimed she smelled imperially Russian. Another said she smelled like Polish cabbage. These were actual courtroom testimonies. When the court finally ruled that there was insufficient evidence to prove that Anna Anderson was Anastasia Romanov, the world had already made up its mind. To some, she would always be the lost princess, if not in blood, then in narrative necessity. She died in 1984, frail and bitter, still clinging to her story. Her ashes were scattered near a remote convent, as if even in death she deserved an ending soaked in obscurity and enigma. Then science crashed the party. In the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, a team of Russian and American scientists exhumed a set of bones from a forest outside Ekaterinburg. DNA testing confirmed what many had quietly feared and others had fervently denied. The entire Romanov family, Nicholas, Alexandra, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and yes, Anastasia, had perished that night in 1918. The missing bodies of Alexei and Anastasia, long rumored to have escaped, were found years later in a separate grave, identified, cataloged, matched. The fairy tale ended not with a reunion, but with a report. But here's the thing, people still didn't care. You could show them charts, mitochondrial DNA matches, bone-length ratios. Still, the myth of Anastasia remained stubbornly alive, like a Russian nesting doll that wouldn't stop revealing new layers of denial. Why? Because the truth is boring. The truth is brutal. The truth says that a 16-year-old girl was lined up, lied to, shot, and dumped in a pit because her bloodline offended a revolution. The myth says she escaped. The myth gives us a survivor, not a martyr, and we always prefer the former. There's something distinctly human, perhaps shamefully so, about our refusal to let Anastasia go. We do not weep for Olga or Tatiana or even Alexei with the same fervor. Anastasia became the chosen memory, perhaps because she was young and vivacious, perhaps because she was cheeky in photographs, or perhaps because her name rolls off the tongue with all the weight of a bedtime story. She became the vessel we poured our guilt into. A world that watched a royal family vanish and did nothing had to invent at least one miracle to sleep at night. Modern Russia, too, eventually bent to the weight of the legend. In 2000, the Russian Orthodox Church canonized the Romanovs, not as saints for their policies, God knows they had enough disasters between them, but as passion bearers, meaning they suffered their fate with Christian humility. It's a theological workaround for sanctifying a czar without having to endorse czarism. Pilgrims now visit the church on the blood in Ekaterinburg, built on the site of the Apatiev house, to leave offerings and light candles in Anastasia's name. The irony? The original house was bulldozed in 1977 under the orders of then local Communist Party chief Boris Yeltsin, who feared it might become a royalist pilgrimage site. It did anyway, because you can't demolish a myth with a wrecking ball. The gift shops sell matryoshka dolls shaped like the imperial family, their painted eyes wide with the innocence of people who have no idea what history has in store. Tour guides whisper ghost stories. Children recite lines from the animated 1997 Anastasia film, which, despite being wildly inaccurate and featuring an undead Rasputin with a green bat sidekick, somehow did more to preserve her image than any textbook. In the end, Anastasia's tragic fate tells us far more about ourselves than it does about her. We want the world to be just. We want stories of survival. We want to believe that someone, even in the darkest of times, slipped through the cracks and made it out. That belief comforts us. It tells us we might survive too. But real survival doesn't come with tiaras and waltzes. It comes with pain, with silence, with the dull ache of knowing the world moved on without justice. So let Anastasia be remembered, not just as the ghost of what could have been, but as the girl who truly was. The girl who laughed at her sister's jokes in a freezing house, who sketched stories in the dark, who faced her death with more courage than most of us could summon in life. Her legend may be fiction, but her humanity was not. And perhaps that's a legacy that matters most. If you've made it this far, thank you. History doesn't always offer us clean answers or satisfying endings, but it does leave behind echoes. And by listening to them, we keep memory alive. Not as fantasy, but as truth. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and please, for the love of all things imperial, don't believe every duchess who shows up with a locket and a dramatic backstory. Hey guys, imagine slipping into a dress so vibrant it makes the whole ballroom gasp, only to spend the next week coughing up blood and watching your nails turn black. That's not a dramatic plotting error in a gothic novel. That was Tuesday night fashion in the 19th century. You're about to discover how style literally poisoned society. Collars that corroded skin, hats that made brains boil, and perfumes so lethal they'd drop you like a stone. Buckle up for a whirlwind tour through the deadly art of looking good. Before you settle in, hit like and subscribe, but only if you enjoy diving headfirst into history's most absurd nightmares. Now dim the lights, careful not to inhale that amazing fragrance, and let's unravel the toxic tapestry of 19th century couture. The story begins in the early 1800s when industrial dye-making leapt from labs into ladies' wardrobes. Gone were the days of humble woad and madder root. Enter an era of synthetic brilliance. In 1814, a young Swedish chemist named Carl Wilhelm Scheele synthesized arsenic-based pigments that produced a hypnotic green unlike anything seen before. He called it Scheele's green, though contemporaries dubbed it Emerald of Death. Why? Because it contained up to 80% arsenic, a known slow-acting poison. Yet its hue was irresistible. So vivid it outshone emeralds, so bright it glowed under candlelight. By the mid-19th century, arsenic green dresses, shawls, and ribbons had become the height of fashion. Women paraded down promenades draped in silk dyed with arsenic, unaware that each swish released invisible clouds of toxic dust. Gentle breezes carried microscopic arsenic crystals, so light they floated like confetti, only to settle on skin, weave into hair, and drift into lungs. Suddenly, a genteel stroll in Hyde Park doubled as a chemical warfare experiment. Symptoms often began innocuously, a headache here, a faint rash there. But arsenic is a master of disguise, mimicking gastrointestinal disorders, chronic fatigue, even melancholia. Doctors prescribe tonics and rest cures, oblivious to the real culprit, the dresses themselves. Yet, fashion's siren song was too powerful. Ladies who swapped emerald gowns for safer hues found themselves shunned, their wardrobes deemed mournful and passé. Better to risk a cough than face social exile. Meanwhile, green wallpaper joined the movement. Scheele's green became the crown jewel of interior decor. Aristocrats wallpapered entire salons with it, believing that arsenic's antimicrobial properties would ward off pests. Instead, mold feeding on the damp backing converted arsenic into a gaseous form, arsine, which drifted silently through the room. At night, residents complained of chest pains and delirium. Some awoke to find themselves covered in green-tinged pustules. The condition was christened green sickness, though it had more in common with chemical asphyxiation than any romanticized anemia. By the 1860s, physicians began linking the outbreaks to the color. One intrepid French doctor, Etienne Léon Gérôme, published a treatise warning against arsenic pigments. It sold poorly. After all, how could one criticize a color that rivaled peacocks in fairy tale forests? Fashion magazines dismissed his findings as scaremongering. Hardly surprising, since advertisers paid handsomely for color plates featuring the latest emerald ensembles. Social pressure drowned scientific caution in a sea of compliments and social cachet. Yet arsenic wasn't the only villain in the wardrobe. In the 1840s, chemists discovered a way to make vivid reds using mercury compounds. Mercury red, as it was called, gave dresses, parasols, and even gloves a hue so arresting it turned heads across Europe. But mercury is neurotoxic. It accumulates in the brain, causing tremors, mood swings, and a condition Victorian doctors labeled hysterical paralysis. Women wearing mercury-drenched attire often complained of numbness in their fingers, slurred speech, and sudden rages, behavior chalked up to feminine temperament rather than chemical damage. Enter the corset, steel-boned, lace-edged torture devices that cinched waists down to improbably narrow circumferences. Beyond the crushing aesthetics, corsets soaked in mildew-resistant pesticides, arsenic again, seeped toxins through skin and lung. Noble women perched on chaises longues, sipping tea, unaware that their raiment was leaching poison into every tissue. Complaints of vertigo, shortness of breath, and digestive collapse were so common, they became standard footnotes in etiquette manuals. A woman fainting at a ball was quite the tragic romantic, not a medical emergency. Children were not exempt. Little girls toddled about in pastel gowns streaked with lead oxide whites and cadmium yellows, both heavy metals that impair cognitive development. Paint-laden ribbons braided into hair, sleeves trimmed with luminous powders, and shoes glazed with metallic sheen turned nurseries into miniature toxic factories. By adolescence, behavior issues and learning difficulties abounded. Teachers blamed willful idleness. Doctors advised more exercise outdoors. In reality, arsenic and lead were rewriting neural pathways with every breath. Perfume offered no respite. To mask the stench of sweat and disease in urban centers drenched with coal smoke, perfumers concocted fragrances rich in phthalates and benzene derivatives. Some blends included hydrocyanic acid, yes, cyanide, for its sweet almond undertones. A spritz before dinner could mean inhaling enough poison to send neural signals on a chaotic joyride. Grand Salon often filled with fainting guests, prompting new accessories. Scented handkerchiefs perfumed with lavender oil, ironically sold as antidotes to the chemical cocktails lingering in the air. By 1880, fashion's war on human biology was impossible to ignore. Public outcry burgeoned as newspapers detailed garment-induced epidemics. One London editor quipped, "Our ladies die in style." Moralists decried the barbarism of beauty, while reformers petitioned Queen Victoria to ban arsenic dyes. The Queen herself, ever the symbol of propriety, refused. She donned a private collection of green silks, citing loyalty to industry and empire. Her example emboldened manufacturers, who ramped up arsenic pigment production, arguing that regulation would tarnish British ingenuity. Enter chemist Robert Friedel in 1882, whose investigative journalism exposed secret dye formulations hidden beneath layers of trade secrecy. He published a landmark report with gas-lit illustrations of lungs stained green with arsenic, hearts mottled by mercury, and brains blackened by lead. The report stirred moral outrage. Readers recoiled at the thought that beauty could be a death sentence. Yet even Friedel's damning exposé struggled to shift popular taste. When new, safe dyes arrived, aniline derivatives touted as harmless, fashionistas complained they lacked depth, while women continued to pay in pallor and pain for the perfect shade. The final act of this toxic tragedy unfolded in the closing years of the century. In 1898, France held a grand exposition showcasing modern wonders: artificial diamonds, electric lights, and nickel-plated parasols. But one pavilion, a riot of emerald drapes, was cordoned off by doctors. Visitors who entered exhibited tremors within minutes. Labels proclaimed poisoned luxury in bold letters. The government finally banned arsenic-based pigments, but not before an estimated 50,000 textile workers, seamstresses, and socialites suffered chronic poisoning. And yet, the legacy of 19th century poisonous fashion endures. Museum collections carefully stabilize arsenic-green gowns to prevent decay and dust release. Conservationists don hazmat suits when handling certain antique parasols. Modern forensics can detect trace lead in Victorian lipstick. The next time you admire a vintage frock in a glass case, remember, those stitches once seethed with chemicals that whispered through pores and lungs. A silent reminder that vanity often comes at a deadly price. Stay tuned for part 2, where we'll dive into the personal stories of those poisoned by fashion's cruel brilliance. The seamsters who died in workshops, the debutantes who faded away, and the groundbreaking crusaders who battled the toxic tide for public health. This nightmare is only beginning, and the cost of looking good has never been higher. And so we pick up the poisoned thread of fashion's dark tapestry, where every needlepoint and dye vat carried a silent curse. In part 2, we'll unravel the human cost, the seamstresses who mopped arsenic-drenched floors with their bare hands, the debutantes whose emerald gowns became their funeral shrouds, and the crusaders, doctors, and reformers who battled factories and salons alike in a desperate quest to save lives. Brace yourselves. The true face of 19th century style is far uglier than any frayed hem. First, the seamstresses of death row. In 26-story red brick tenements lining the River Thames, workshops throbbed with the hum of looms and the hiss of steam presses. By day, rows of young women sat hunched over benches, applying Scheele's green to yards of silk and velvet. By night, they returned to cramped, unlit garrets, skin glazed with invisible toxins. They called it the Green Room, but it was closer to a death chamber. Take the case of Eliza Morton, a 19-year-old seamstress who arrived in London from rural Kent with 2 suitcases and a naive hope. Hired at a rate of 6 pence an hour, she learned quickly. The bosses didn't inspect fingertips coated in green dust. They counted pieces finished. Eliza's chores included rinsing dyed fabrics in troughs of cold water, a final rinse that bubbled with arsenic. No gloves were provided, of course. She soaked her hands in dishwater at home, believing the prickle in her palms was just the price of beautiful gowns. Within months, Eliza's hair fell in wispy clumps, her nails blackened and her teeth loosened. She complained of stomach cramps so severe they felt like hot irons coiling around her intestines. Local physicians, ignorant of industrial chemistry, diagnosed neuralgia and prescribed laudanum, an opiate tincture that only masked her vomiting and dizziness. Eliza's wages paid for the medicine. The medicine deepened her dependence, and the dependence chained her to the workshop. At 22, she collapsed mid-shift, convulsing so violently that her fellow workers fled in terror. Eliza died in a parish infirmary 3 days later, intestines perforated by latent poisoning. Her bosses claimed ignorance. Factory inspectors deemed her death unrelated to work. A death certificate cited acute gastric inflammation. Meanwhile, her body was buried in a pauper's grave on the outskirts of Brompton, unmarked save for a simple wooden cross stained green by residual dyes. Eliza's story was far from unique. In Manchester's dye districts, teams of inspectors registered skyrocketing mortality among female employees. some reporting arsenic levels in hair 500 times higher than safe limits. Yet industry leaders argued that regulation would wreck the economy. Better a few sacrifices for national prosperity than the collapse of British textile dominance, they proclaimed. The thousands of dead seamstresses were reduced to statistical footnotes in boardroom minutes. Doucera, the debutantes who faded away. At the same time, London's Ton and Paris's Haute Monde sparkled with young debutantes spinning onto dance floors swathed in the latest poisonous hues. These girls were the daughters of dukes and earls, sent to finishing schools where color mastery was a social art form. To miss the emerald trend was social suicide. To embrace it was to dance with death. Consider Lady Beatrice Sinclair, a 17-year-old debutante of impeccable pedigree. Her mother commissioned a custom gown from a celebrated dressmaker who mixed Scheele's green with brilliant ultramarine for a teal effect. On the night of her ball, Beatrice swirled across the marble floor, the gaslights igniting her skirt in phosphorescent waves. She was the cynosure of every eye, until 2 hours later, when she fainted full length into a bowl of rose petals. Doctors diagnosed emotional exhaustion. They did not mention the rosewater petals laced with arsenic residues from the surrounding damask. Over the following weeks, Beatrice developed a persistent cough that rattled her ribcage. At breakfast, she gasped between sips of chamomile tea. At night, she awoke drenched in sweat, convinced ghosts were dragging her across the silken sheets. Her once high spirits crumpled beneath the invisible weight of toxins. Family physician, Dr. Algernon Witherspoon ordered rest and cod liver oil. Beatrice's condition only deteriorated. She perished in April 1868, one pale hand clutching a rose embroidered on her pillowcase. The obituary praised her gentle nature and radiant beauty, omitting all mention of arsenic or dye vats. Not all victims were aristocrats, of course. Middle-class girls attending summer garden parties often donned green sashes and parasols tipped in Scheele's green. They, too, suffered the same twitching eyelids, fainting fits, and inexplicable fevers. Newspapers printed polite notes: Miss Henrietta Thompson, stricken after Ascot recovering, or Miss Eleanor Finch succumbs to sudden illness. Conspiracy theories suggested drinks spiked rum or contaminated water, but the deadly dresses remained unexamined. 3. The woeful whiffs of lethal perfume. Meanwhile, a different kind of poison hung in the air, the seductive reek of 19th century perfume. When city streets reeked of coal smoke and horse manure, a new industry promised sweet relief. Perfumers concocted scents containing lead acetate, phthalates, and hydrocyanic acid to achieve heady top notes of almond, moss, and gardenia. Socialites spritzed themselves liberally, twice before dinner, once after, and often collapsed mid-conversation. It was the case of Mrs. Constance Whitaker that first alarmed medical circles. Mrs. Whitaker, a prominent hostess in Mayfair, had transformed her townhouse into an olfactory wonderland, hanging delicate sachets of Blue Nile essence in every room. Guests inhaled vapors that tasted like the breath of Eden, as one critic rhapsodized. But within 2 hours, Mrs. Whitaker herself began to drain color from her face. She stumbled to a perfumed vanity, threw up in a porcelain bowl, and sank to the floor, lifeless. The coroner's inquest revealed cyanide concentrations in blood exceeding toxic thresholds. The body was embalmed with arsenical solutions, an ironic final flourish. Despite high-profile cases, the perfume trade pressed on unimpeded, protected by trade guilds and the romantic notion that a woman's scent was her most intimate signature. Journalists who dared expose the chemical recipes were sued for libel. Meanwhile, sanitary perfumes entered the market, featuring only nature's own ingredients, primarily rosewater and violet oil, at premium prices. Of course, cheap imitations circulated in flea markets, carrying the same toxic compounds as before, now relabeled in flowing script to deceive the unwary. The crusaders for clean clothes. Not everyone accepted fashion's fatal beauty. A handful of medical professionals, social reformers, and maverick chemists single-handedly fought battles that would take decades to win. Dr. Marie Faust, a Parisian physician working in the shadow of Pasteur's laboratories, became France's first vocal critic of arsenic dyes. In 1865, she published Poison in Our Parlors, a pamphlet that combined toxicology experiments with harrowing case studies. She painted water green with dissolved dresses, then administered samples to lab rabbits, each rabbit convulsing within minutes. Dr. Faust's pamphlet sold out in hours, but salons ignored her warnings. She received hate mail, bricks through her windows, and a failed assassination attempt involving a cyanide-laced letter. Undeterred, she founded the Association for Non-Toxic Textiles in 1870, rallying seamstresses and housewives to her cause. In England, Dr. Henry Crichton, a chemist turned investigative journalist, infiltrated dye factories as a paid laborer. He kept meticulous notebooks full of recipes. 3 parts Scheele's green, 1 part copper acetate, dust vigorously for 6 hours. He mailed these recipes to Parliament, but his efforts stalled when MPs declared that interfering with commerce amounted to socialism. Undaunted, Dr. Crichton published exposés in the Times, complete with illustrations of factory conditions, vats of scalding emerald liquor, rows of women stirring and inhaling the fumes, supervisors counting finished bolts without gloves. His most damning article, The Emerald Plague, concluded, each yard of fabric is a footnote in a death warrant. Grassroots activists organized violet parties to promote undyed fabrics and natural colorants. Women swapped arsenic green ribbons for beetroot red, sent away for madder root from America, and wore corsages dyed with indigo and walnut husks. These gatherings, though small, forged communities of conscientious consumers. They circulated recipes for homemade dyes, tannin from oak bark, turmeric root baths, logwood extracts that produce respectable if muted hues. Their motto, beauty need not be a curse. Eindaude, the legislative struggle and its aftermath. By the 1880s, the mounting evidence of poisoning collisions forced governments to act, albeit grudgingly and after endless debate. In 1885, France passed the Loi sur les substances nocives, banning arsenic in textiles. Factories scrambled to replace emerald with Paris green, a copper-based pigment slightly less toxic but still lethal. Britain followed in 1888 with the Arsenic and Phosphorus Prohibition Act, only to discover that enforcement was virtually impossible. Inspectors lacked chemical field kits. Many dyes were imported from Germany under false labels. It wasn't until the 1898 International Congress of Hygiene and Demography in Brussels that a multinational treaty finally standardized banlets, arsenic, lead, mercury compounds, and cyanide derivatives. Textile boards, perfumers, and fashion houses were forced to reformulate. Synthetic aniline dyes passed muster for the first time, though some still cause contact dermatitis. Corset makers replaced arsenical stiffeners with steel boning and cotton canvas, and perfumers turned to essential oils and alcohol bases for scent diffusion. By 1900, the age of poisonous fashion had largely ended, at least on paper, but the legacy endured. Textile mills required new machinery to wash out residual toxins. Conservators today must handle antique garments in ventilated hoods, and historians write footnotes on the green patina of Victorian wallpaper, warning visitors never to lean too close. Thus closes part 2 of our 4-part odyssey into the poisonous fashions of the 19th century. We've traced the human toll in workshops, ballrooms, and parlors, met the women who fell to toxic dyes and perfumes, and cheered on the brave crusaders who fought for clean clothes. In part 3, we'll explore how these scandals reshaped public health, ignited scientific breakthroughs, and transformed the very fabric of industrial regulation. The nightmare continues, and the cost of looking good has left scars that lasted generations. And now, dear viewers, brace yourselves for part 3, where the poisonous fashions of the 19th century crash headlong into the machinery of public health, spark scientific revolutions, and force governments to wrestle with the unwieldy beast of industrial regulation. Ready your gas masks of sarcasm. We're plunging into the bureaucratic underbelly of style's most toxic era. First, and most urgently, the scandal of the workshops could no longer be papered over by euphemisms like neuralgia or melancholia. By the 1880s, hospitals in London's East End and Lyons dye districts were overflowing with patients suffering from textile fever, a terrifying melange of gastrointestinal hemorrhage, severe dermatitis, and crippling neuropathy. Surgeons extracted arsenic-soaked dress fragments from patient wounds. Dentists reported rampant mercury-induced tooth decay. Neurologists documented cases of what we now call peripheral neuropathy so severe that some workers lost entire fingers. These grim statistics provoked the first real stirrings of a centralized public health movement. The British Royal Commission on Toxic Textiles convened in 1886, Seabright with eminent physicians, chemists, and, inevitably, industry representatives intent on minimizing liability. During marathon hearings, witnesses described fatal episodes: a pregnant seamstress miscarrying after months of exposure, a dye house foreman's daughter developing irreversible tremors at age 10, entire families decimated by contaminated wallpaper that released arsenic in humid weather. One tearful testimony came from the widow of a young dyer who carried her husband's arsenic-stained handkerchief in her apron pocket, convinced it was his last kiss. But for every harrowing tale, factory owners dismissed blame. They trotted out modern sanitary improvements: open windows, if windy, ale brewed on site to wash down any stray particles, and weekly inspections by underpaid clerks too afraid to refuse gifts of green ribbons. Their lawyers argued with breathtaking cynicism that a certain degree of risk is inherent to all trades, and that any stricter laws would dismantle the sweet commerce of British textiles. Meanwhile, the poorest workers, women, children, recent immigrants, continued to breathe arsenic dust as casually as they drew breath. In response, a handful of maverick scientists stepped into the fray. Dr. Eugenie Vaux, a Swiss chemist educated in Paris, devised simple field tests for arsenic on fabric, an acid solution that turned emerald dye a sickly ochre. She pioneered the concept of chemical policing, training labor inspectors to carry portable kits and demand immediate dye substitutions. Her lectures, delivered before skeptical city councils, were bone-chilling. She demonstrated how water runoff from textile mills could poison entire rivers, turning trout bellies green and killing fish by the millions. In Germany, Dr. Friedrich Heinemann's groundbreaking work in occupational medicine linked mercury vapors in glove factories to the glovemaker's palsy, a then enigmatic disorder of tremors and speech impairment. He synthesized the term industrial neuronopathy, arguing firmly that governments must regulate airborne toxins just as they regulated food and water supplies. His 1889 pamphlet, Labors of Life and Death, offered not just grim diagnostics but practical blueprints for ventilation systems, protective gloves, and mandatory rest periods. Yet factories remained reluctant to retrofit. Profit margins clashed violently with medical evidence. At the turn of the century, a pivotal moment arrived: the 1902 International Conference on Public Health in Brussels. Delegates from 50 nations gathered to hammer out treaties on food safety, sanitation, and, most contentiously, workplace toxins. Heated debates erupted over the inclusion of toxic dyes in the draft resolution. British delegates, led by a well-meaning but politically hamstrung Home Secretary, argued for voluntary guidelines. French and Scandinavian representatives, citing Dr. Fox River data and Norway's early ban on arsenical wallpaper, demanded binding bans. Ultimately, a compromise emerged. The Brussels Accord of 1902 mandated that member nations catalog toxic industrial substances and establish national regulatory bodies empowered to inspect, fine, and even shut down non-compliant factories. Although the accord lacked teeth, no central enforcement mechanism existed. It marked the first time governments collectively acknowledged that beauty must bow to biology. Within 5 years, France, Germany, and Belgium had passed strict laws against arsenic and mercury dyes. Britain followed in 1908 with the Textile Poisoning Prevention Act, complete with residential inspections and penalties of up to £100 per offense, but legislation alone could not reverse decades of toxic damage. The medical aftermath lingered for generations. In Yorkshire's woolen mills, children born in the 1900s still exhibited learning delays linked to maternal lead exposure. In Lancashire, veterans of the dye industry formed pensioner collectives demanding compensation for chronic neuropathies. The notion of industrial disease entered the legal lexicon, enabling some to sue for disability. Though success required grueling court battles and reams of expert testimony, factories eroded under the weight of liability, often declaring bankruptcy and reopening under new names to dodge payouts. From the wreckage of this regulatory struggle came unexpected scientific breakthroughs. The quest to replace toxic pigments spurred the birth of synthetic organic chemistry, and with it, the dyes that colored our 20s flapper dresses and beyond. Alizarin crimson, an aniline-derived red introduced in 1868, became the template for safer dyes. Indigo was synthesized without lead vats, and chemists learned to tether color molecules to fibers via organic bonds rather than metal salts. These innovations laid the groundwork for modern petrochemical industries and the entirely new set of environmental and health challenges we face today. Yet one cannot help but marvel that so much progress sprang from the crucible of poison. Equally transformative was the realization that public health must be proactive, not reactive. In the wake of the Brussels Accord, many countries established national health boards empowered to collect industrial hygiene data, fund epidemiological studies, and launch public awareness campaigns. Posters appeared in factory break rooms bearing grim slogans: "Your green gown could kill you, wash those hands," and in schools, "Ask your teacher about the dangers of lead in your crayons." These early 20th century campaigns prefigured modern OSHA, regulations and environmental protection agencies. Culturally, the shift rippled through fashion itself. Designers began to frame natural muted tones as the new chic, sepia, olive, dusty rose, capitalizing on the fear of toxin couture. Parisian couturiers advertised pure silk and color-fast, arsenic-free dyes, turning safety into a status symbol. Magazines devoted entire issues to healthful elegance, showcasing gowns cut for comfort, ventilated corsets reinforced with whalebone rather than steel, and accessories made of polished horn or unpainted wood. The goddess of style had, at last, been tamed by the goddess of survival. By the 1910s, the poisonous fashion era had receded into memory, but not into oblivion. Historians of medicine and fashion alike revisit the green-tinged horrors to remind us that innovation without ethics can kill. Museums carefully label arsenic-dyed dresses with hazard ribbons and display antique gas mask prototypes once marketed to imperiled ladies. Restoration experts don protective gear to handle wallpaper samples. Conservation labs screen their artifacts for heavy metals before permitting public display. And yet, the echoes persist. Contemporary fast fashion practices sometimes mirror past recklessness. Cheap dyes produced in unregulated factories, lax oversight of chemical runoff, and worker exploitation that echoes the seamstresses of yore. As we scroll through online boutiques, snapping up splashes of color for a tenner, the ghosts of Scheele's green murmur warnings about beauty's hidden price. So let this chapter of history, where arsenic, mercury, and lead stalked velvet corridors and gaslit salons, stand not only as a grotesque carnival of style, but as a testament to the power of public health, scientific inquiry, and collective action. The regulatory frameworks born from that toxic crucible underpin our modern safeguards, and the tragedies endured by seamstresses and debutantes alike demand that we remain vigilant. In Part 4, we'll return to the personal front lines, following the descendants of those poisoned workers, exploring the legal battles for compensation, and tracing how those early reformers' lessons shaped the 20th and 21st century fight for just chemical safety, from DDT bans to PFAS regulations. The nightmare may have shifted its dress code, but its lessons remain as urgent as ever. Stay tuned, and next time you admire a hue, remember the price paid for that brilliance. And so we arrive at the final stitch in our tapestry of toxic style. The era when the wounds inflicted by arsenic-green gowns and mercury-red parasols finally began to heal, even as the ghosts of past fashion sins lingered in every seam. In Part 4, we'll follow the descendants of those poisoned artisans, witness the long fight for justice, and trace the ripple effects of 19th century chemical recklessness into our modern battles over DDT, PFAS, and the ever-changing palette of safe style. First, the human reckoning. In the early 1910s, as textile factories retooled and arsenic dyes vanished, families still bore the scars of decades in the dye house trenches. In Yorkshire's mill towns, pension records began listing industrial neuropathy and chronic arsenicosis as recognized disabilities. Small towns erected memorials, granite plinths bearing brass plaques, to the daughters of green, seamstresses who gave their lives to clothe the empire. These monuments, though modest, marked a cultural shift. Working women were no longer invisible, laborers but martyrs of progress. Take the case of Margaret Bell, a seamstress born in 1895, whose grandmother, Eliza Morton, from Part 2, perished in an arsenic-drenched workshop. Margaret spent her childhood hearing tales of Ma'am's green hands, vignettes of a determined woman stitching emerald gowns even as her fingertips bled. When Margaret turned 16, she refused to enter a mill, instead apprenticing with aniline chemists who pioneered safer dyes. Her work helped perfect early azo pigments, and she later led an advocacy group for textile workers' health. At age 80, she stood before a crowd of her peers, many in wheelchairs or using canes, and declared, "We survived the Green Scourge, and we will never let fashion kill again." Margaret's activism foreshadowed larger legal battles. In 1920, a landmark case in Manchester saw 10 former dye house workers sue the Britannia Textile Company for compensation. Their lawyer, a fiery labor activist named Edith Sinclair, marshaled decades of medical records, factory logs, and depositions from toxicologists who traced every victim's symptoms to specific dye vats. The defense argued that industrial hazards are accepted risks, but Sinclair countered, "These women did not choose arsenic in their tea. They were drenched in it from headscarves to hem edges." In a precedent-shattering verdict, the jury awarded each plaintiff a lump sum and lifelong pensions, a legal recognition that occupational disease was a harm-deserving remedy. That judgment reverberated across Europe and North America. Other lawsuits followed suit. 5,000 workers in Germany, 1,200 in France, and dozens of factory towns in the United States, where the textile boom had also embraced arsenic and lead-based pigments. Though many companies declared bankruptcy to dodge payouts, insurance underwriters began to require toxic coverage for manufacturers, a new line item on industrial policies that, for the first time, accounted for chemical liabilities. By the 1930s, large corporations absorbed the costs as a routine business expense, embedding worker safety into balance sheets rather than boardroom footnotes. But while the law advanced, memory remained contested. In the 1940s, a movement of nostalgic designers sought to revive vintage charm by reenacting 19th century styles, corseted waists, lush velvets, jewel-toned dyes, without fully heeding the scientific lessons of the past. Experimental theaters filled stages with period costumes dyed in modern aniline greens so vivid they rivaled Scheele's original hue. Yet critics warned, are we certain these pigments pose no long-term risks? The apparel press dismissed such cautions as fashion alarmism, echoing the same complacency that had allowed arsenic to flourish a century earlier. Fortunately, this retro revival was short-lived. Savvy consumers, armed with fledgling consumer protection agencies, demanded proof of safety before slipping into emerald satin. Meanwhile, the chemical revolution set in motion by 19th century poison fashion gave rise to entirely new challenges. The development of DDT in the 1940s, celebrated as a miracle insecticide, echoed arsenic's dual nature, brilliant effectiveness coupled with silent persistence. Just as arsenic dyes had seeped into lungs and soil, DDT permeated ecosystems, bioaccumulating in fish and birds. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, 1962, would cast DDT as fashion's chemical kin, an insidious pollutant dressed in the guise of progress. The public, primed by memories of industrial poisons, responded with unprecedented fervor, leading to DDT bans and the creation of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency in 1970. The parallels continued into the late 20th and early 21st centuries with PFAS, forever chemicals used in waterproof fabrics, non-stick coatings, and cosmetics. These compounds, prized for their durability and resistance, whispered promises of stain-proof elegance. Yet, like their 19th century predecessors, PFAS resist degradation, lodging in soil and bloodstreams for generations. Communities near manufacturing plants report elevated cancer rates, thyroid disorders, and immune system disruptions, echoes of the green gown cancers that haunted Victorian mill towns. Grassroots coalitions of residents echoing Edith Sinclair's legal playbook have launched lawsuits securing multi-million-dollar settlements and stricter federal regulations on PFAS use. In the realm of cosmetics, history repeats yet again. Mercury once glossed lips, lead brightened cheeks, arsenic cleared complexions. Today, the market still sees unregulated beauty products containing heavy metals or endocrine-disrupting chemicals, especially in gray market imports and fad skin lightening creams. Public health agencies struggle to keep pace. Every so often, a toxic toner scandal erupts in headlines, consumers return jars of whitening paste, and regulators scramble to test and ban the ingredients. The cycle of discovery, outrage, and reform mirrors the 19th century rhythm, artifice and allure followed by revelation and reform. So what have we learned from this long, laborious struggle? First, that the marriage of style and industrial chemistry demands ethical stewardship from the outset. Back in the 1800s, chemists pursued new dyes without a thought for human cost. Lab notebooks brimmed with color charts but omitted toxicity data. Today, the concept of green chemistry mandates that inventors consider environmental and health impacts before scale-up, a precautionary principle inspired by the bitter lessons of poisons past. Second, that collective action is the fulcrum of change. A lone doctor's pamphlet or a handful of lawsuits could not, on their own, topple the arsenic empire. Only when workers, physicians, consumers, and honest legislators converged did the machinery of reform begin to turn. Modern movements against BPA in plastics, microplastics in cosmetics, or flame retardants in textiles follow the same script. Data and testimony feed public awareness, which fuels regulatory pressure, which finally compels industry to adapt. Third, that memory matters. When museums and archives preserve arsenic-green dresses behind glass and label them with hazard warnings, they keep alive a story that might otherwise fade into glamour-tinged nostalgia. Public history projects, walking tours of former mill districts, documentary films on textile toxins remind us that every trend carries a backstory, often written in the blood and sweat of invisible workers. Without those reminders, society risks repeating history's worst excesses. Finally, the tale binds us across centuries. When you swipe on a bold lip color, wear water-resistant fabrics, or admire a flash of neon in a vintage market, you carry forward a legacy that sprang from blithe disregard for the body's limits. The bright hues of the 19th century seduced a generation into slow self-poisoning. The flashy finishes of today seduce us into thinking convenience trumps caution. The questions remain pressing. Who pays when a fabric's finish migrates into drinking water? Whose lungs falter from inhaled nanoparticles? And how do we, as consumers and citizens, demand transparency before tragedy strikes? So, dear viewers, as we close this 4-part odyssey through the poisonous fashions of the 19th century and beyond, remember that style and safety need not be adversaries. The very chemists who once concocted arsenic green went on to pioneer synthetic dyes that brighten our world without killing it. The same ingenuity can, and must, fuel a future where elegance and ethics walk hand in hand. Thank you for journeying through time with me, from Scheele's lethal lab to modern chemical frontiers. May the scarlet of mercury and the emerald of arsenic remind us that beauty unchecked can be a sword against our own throats. And may our vigilance, curiosity, and collective resolve ensure that the next wave of innovation dazzles without danger. Stay stylish, stay safe, and above all, stay curious.